Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1. The House at the End of the Alley. When I moved to New York, I thought it would be a fresh start. After a divorce and losing my job in my small town, I needed somewhere to start over. The city that never sleeps seemed like the perfect choice. The small house at the end of an alley in Brooklyn caught my eye from the moment I saw it. The realtor called it a hidden gem, and with the surprisingly low rent, I couldn't resist. Even though the house looked dated, with its stained brick walls and dusty windows, I figured it would be cozy with a little cleaning. But as soon as I signed the lease, the realtor suddenly became impatient. He didn't want to answer my questions about the previous tenants. "They moved out, that's all," he said, his eyes averted. When I tried to ask more, he made up an excuse that he had another appointment and left quickly, leaving me standing in the empty living room with a vague sense of unease. For the first week, everything seemed normal. I spent time arranging my belongings, getting to know the neighborhood, and making friends with a few neighbors. But every time I stepped out of the house, I always had the feeling of being watched. Eyes from the opposite window, blurry figures in the narrow alley, or sometimes from my own house. One night, as I sat writing at the table near the window, a cold wind blew from somewhere, sending a chill down my spine. I looked up through the opaque glass and noticed someone standing in the corner of the alley, motionless. The shadow did not move, did not make a sound. When I blinked, the shadow disappeared. I told myself that maybe I was imagining things, but from that night on, strange sounds began to appear. At first, it was just a soft creaking of the wooden stairs, but then it turned into slow footsteps, as if someone was walking around in the middle of the night. Occasionally, I would hear whispers coming from the walls, as if someone was talking very close, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. Every night, I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The darkness seemed thicker than usual. My heart pounded loudly in my chest, matching the steady rhythm of the strange noises. And then, one night, I heard a knock on the door. 3 soft knocks, steady and clear. I sat up, staring at the locked wooden door. The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. I swallowed, taking slow steps closer to the door. When I pressed my ear to the door, everything suddenly stopped. There was no one there. I opened the door, a crack looking out into the dark and empty hallway. The old walls were moldy, and the flickering hallway lights cast eerie shadows on the old tiles. No one was there. I closed the door, leaned against the wall, and felt like I had just stepped into a terrible dream. But from that moment on, I knew that I was not alone in this house. And the scariest thing was that whatever was here, it didn't want me to leave. That night was the beginning of my sleepless nights. The unexplained noises continued to appear every night, like an eerie melody repeating itself in the darkness. Footsteps slowly echoed down the stairs, then stopped right in front of my bedroom door. Sometimes I heard giggling from somewhere in the house. The laughter was unclear, like a child's, but also somewhat distorted and twisted. When I opened the door to check, everything was strangely quiet. Only the hallway light flickered, creating dancing shadows on the walls. I started sleeping with the lights on, but that only seemed to make things more frightening. The bedroom light would sometimes turn off and then come back on by itself, as if someone was fiddling with the switch. I tried calling the power company to check, but they insisted that the electrical system in the area was normal. One night, when things got too much, I decided to record the sounds in the house. I put my phone in the hallway, turned on the recording, and went back to my room, trying to sleep. The next morning, when I opened the recording, I shivered. At first it was just small noises, but then a whispering voice rang out. "Get out." I listened to the recording over and over again, and each time I listened, the fear inside me grew. The voice was not mine, nor was it anyone I knew. It seemed to come from somewhere very far away, or very close, right next to my ear. The following nights I did not dare to sleep. My eyes were dark. My mind was foggy. I began to see shadows passing in the corners of my eyes. And sometimes, I felt like someone was standing at the end of my bed, staring at me. Every time I tried to leave, it was as if an invisible force was holding me back. The house key would disappear, then appear in strange places. The front door was often jammed, and every time I opened it, there was only pitch black darkness outside, like a bottomless pit waiting to swallow me. The small house at the end of the alley, with its old walls and creaking wooden stairs, was now like a trap, and I was the prey, unable to escape. But the scariest thing was, I was no longer sure I wanted to leave. The sleepless nights had worn down my will and sanity. I began to see things that I wasn't sure were real or just hallucinations. Shadows appeared and disappeared in the corners of the room. Doors opened and closed automatically without any trace. Everything in this house seemed to come to life, as if an invisible force controlled everything around me. One night, I decided to install security cameras all over the house to record what was happening. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy, that what I saw and heard was real. Every morning, I sat in front of the screen for hours, rewinding the videos. And then, in a recording at 3 a.m., I saw it. That shadow, tall and blurry, moved back and forth in the hallway. It had no specific shape, just a solid black mass, but exuded an extremely scary feeling. I saw it standing in front of my door, just a few feet away. But the most terrifying thing was that when it moved, there was no sound. Everything was deathly silent. I tried to contact an old friend named Michael, who used to work in the field of paranormal research. Michael agreed to stay with me for a few days to help me figure out what was going on. On the first night, as we sat in the living room, the lights suddenly went out. "Did you see that?" Michael whispered, his eyes fixed on the dark corner of the room. I looked in that direction and saw a shadow move so fast that I wasn't sure if I had actually seen it. "We need to get out of here," Michael said, his voice shaking. But I couldn't. Some part of me was held back by this house, an invisible force that kept me from crossing the threshold. Michael left the next morning, leaving me alone with fear and shadows in this house. After Michael left, I decided to investigate the house's past. I went to the public library and looked up old records about the neighborhood. And what I found made my blood run cold. The house had belonged to the Thompson family in the 1980s. The family consisted of 3 people: a father, a mother, and a young daughter named Lily. One winter night, the family disappeared without a trace. The police investigated but found no clues. Neighbors said that before the disappearance, they often heard loud arguments in the house, along with the sobbing of the child. After the disappearance, the house was abandoned for many years before being sold to a series of tenants. But no one stayed long. Rumors began to spread. Some said they saw dark figures standing behind the windows at night. Others heard footsteps on the stairs when the house was empty. I also found an old newspaper article about a previous tenant. He had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only an empty house and recordings of eerie whispers. His family believed that the house had swallowed him, just as it had the Thompson family. Each new discovery was like a knife stabbing into my fear. I couldn't believe that I had lived in this house, within the walls that had witnessed so much horror. And something inside me began to convince me that if I didn't leave now, I too would become part of this horror story, trapped forever by this house, just like the souls that had been swallowed by it before. After learning about the house's dark past, I could no longer find a reason to stay. But the problem was, I couldn't leave. Every time I stepped out of the door, a heavy feeling weighed down on my shoulders, as if this house had an invisible hand holding me back. Sometimes the front door wouldn't open, or the key would suddenly disappear. I began to doubt myself, wondering if I had accidentally locked myself in this house. One night, as I sat on my bed, the bedroom light flickered on and off. The darkness and light alternated, creating strange shadows on the walls. I heard footsteps, slow but heavy, echoing from the hallway. Cold sweat dripped down my forehead. I held my breath, my heart pounding so fast I thought it would explode in my chest. The door slowly opened, without a sound from the hinges. I stared into the darkness outside the door, but saw nothing. No one. But then, I heard whispers, like the wind whistling through the cracks. "Stay! Don't go!" I screamed and threw whatever I could reach at the door. The door slammed shut, and the house fell silent again. But I knew I was no longer safe. Whatever was here, it had decided that I was its. I started writing in a diary, trying to keep my mind clear. But the pages quickly became a mess of scribbles, incomplete words and strange drawings that I didn't remember drawing. One of them was a dark figure standing by the window, its white eyes staring at me. As time went on, the pages became darker and more confusing, as if a part of me had been taken over by this house. One morning, I woke up to long scratches on my arms, as if someone had scratched my skin while I was sleeping. My fingernails were broken, and there was dried blood under them. I began to wonder if I was hurting myself unconsciously. My dreams became vague and terrifying, blurry images of the Thompson family in the darkness, standing at the end of my bed, silent and empty. On my last night in this house, I knew that if I didn't leave immediately, I would never get the chance again. I packed my things in a panic, throwing everything into a suitcase without bothering to organize it. Everything around me seemed to be against me. Lights flickering, windows opening and closing by themselves. The whispers were no longer vague, but clear. "Don't go. Stay with us." When I reached the front door, it was locked. I turned the key, banging on the old wooden door, but to no avail. It felt like the house was shrinking, the walls getting closer, the space getting smaller. I heard footsteps behind me, the giggles of a child, and the sobs of a woman. I ran to the living room window, breaking the glass with a wooden chair. The cold wind from outside rushed in, bringing with it a breath of fresh air that I had long forgotten. I climbed through the window frame, the glass shards piercing my skin, but I felt no pain. My only goal was to get out of here, to escape this house. As I fell to the sidewalk outside, I looked back one last time. Through the broken window, I saw a dark figure standing there, white eyes following me. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, like hands reaching out to pull me back. I ran through the alley, my legs aching, but I didn't stop. When I got to the main street, I hailed a cab and never looked back at that house again. I left New York the next day. I heard that the house at the end of the alley was still empty. No one dared to rent it anymore. But sometimes, people still saw the lights on in the house in the middle of the night, and the dark figures still stood in the windows, looking out into the dark alley, waiting for the next tenant. After leaving that house, I thought I had escaped the nightmare. I moved to a smaller town, rented a bright apartment with large windows overlooking a garden full of flowers. Everything seemed normal again. During the day, I walked in the park, tried to make new friends. At night, I turned on the lights and read until I was so tired that I fell asleep on the sofa. I no longer dared to sleep in the dark, but the fear did not go away completely. Sometimes, I still heard whispers in my head, like voices coming from the old house. I told myself that it was just a psychological effect, that I needed time to recover. I even tried seeing a psychologist, and they said that I was just suffering from post-traumatic stress. One winter evening, when I returned home from a late night at work, I found the window of my apartment wide open. The curtains fluttered in the cold wind. I remember clearly that I locked the window before leaving. My hand shook as I inserted the key into the lock. The door opened, and the apartment was dark inside. I turned on the light, and the moment the light flooded the room, I saw a dark shadow pass by the corner of my eye. I froze in place. It couldn't be. That house had stayed in New York. How could it have followed me here? I checked every corner of the apartment, every closet door, every hidden corner, but there was nothing strange. Maybe it was just an illusion, I reassured myself. But the fear had begun to creep back in, like a shadow that couldn't be dispelled. In the following nights, I began to hear familiar noises, slow footsteps on the wooden floor, indistinct whispers, and even the giggles of a child. Every time I opened my eyes, everything was quiet again. But I knew I was no longer alone in this apartment. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I felt a cold breath on my neck. My eyes were wide open, not daring to move. It felt like someone was standing right next to my bed, staring at me in the dark. My heart was pounding. Cold sweat was running down my forehead. I could hear breathing, steady and heavy, right next to my ear. I got up and turned on the bedroom light. The pale yellow light dispelled the dense darkness, but in the mirror on the wall, I saw a blurry figure standing behind me. I turned around, but there was no one. When I looked back in the mirror, the figure was still there, just standing still and looking at me with its white eyes. I began to realize that I could not escape. That house was not just a place. It was an entity, something that could be pursued, something that could be possessed. It had followed me, and now it had become a part of my life. As the days went by, I gradually became like the previous tenants. I didn't go out much anymore. The curtains were always closed. The lights were always on at night. I wrote in my diary. Strange drawings appeared on the walls that I didn't remember drawing. The whispers became my constant companions, and sometimes I even talked to them. One morning, when the neighbors called the police because I hadn't appeared for several days, they found me huddled in the corner of the living room, eyes wide open and lifeless. The walls were covered with the word "stay" written in a red liquid, which was later confirmed to be my blood. I don't remember doing it, but when I listened to the recording from my phone, I heard my voice whispering in the dark. Along with other voices, they took me to a psychiatric hospital where I still live today. The doctors said I was severely mentally disturbed, that it was all just a hallucination. But I know the truth. I still hear whispers at night. I still see shadows moving in the corner of the hospital room. That house has not let me go, and I know that wherever it is, it will find me. And maybe one day, when you pass by the house at the end of that alley, you will see a shadow standing by the window, looking out. Don't go near it. Don't open the door. Because once you enter, you will never leave again. Story 2, Dormitory 7. I moved to this small town on a cold autumn afternoon. The barley fields stretched to the horizon. The bare trees stood silently under the grey sky. From the moment I stepped off the old bus, I felt the unusual silence of this place. This town was like another world, where time slowed down and all sounds were swallowed up by the vast space. The university was on the edge of town, surrounded by wild fields and winding red dirt roads. My dormitory, Dormitory 7, was located at the farthest corner of the campus. This old building had peeling paint, rotten wooden window frames, and a rusty iron gate that made an eerie sound when the wind blew through. When I asked about this dormitory, the other students were silent or avoided me. Some looked at me with pity, as if I had made a big mistake. "No one will be there for long," a girl whispered, then quickly disappeared into the crowd. That only made me more curious, but also filled me with a vague sense of dread. The dorm manager was a gaunt old man with sunken eyes and a hoarse voice, like the wind whistling through a crack in a door. He led me down a long hallway, the flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. Each step echoed in the empty space, as if the house itself were breathing with us. My room was at the end of the hallway, room 207. The old wooden door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the small room contained a bunk bed, a desk, and a wardrobe. The top bunk was already set up, which meant I would have a roommate. When I asked about my friend, the manager just shrugged. "He's away. He'll be back soon." I tried to get used to the new space, hanging some family photos on the wall to create a cozy feeling. But the longer I stayed in the room, the more obvious the feeling of being watched became. Sometimes I heard light footsteps on the upper bunk, even though there was clearly no one there. One night, while I was lying in bed, I heard a soft, steady breathing sound right above my head. I held my breath, listening, but not daring to move. The breathing continued, mixed with the sound of the wind whistling through the window, creating a creepy melody. The next morning, I asked the other students about room 207. They looked at me with panicked eyes, as if I had just mentioned a taboo. A boy said in a low voice, "If you hear noises at night, don't open your eyes." That sentence haunted me all day, but I still didn't understand the true meaning behind it. I began to notice strange things in the room. Every morning when I woke up, the furniture in the room seemed to be in disarray. The window was sometimes wide open, though I remembered locking it. And the strangest thing was the small footprints in the dust on the floor, leading from the door to my bed, then disappearing. The footprints were not mine. They were too small, like a child's. Every night, when the lights were turned off, the room was plunged into complete darkness. The sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the door, the soft footsteps in the hallway, and the indistinct whispering kept me from sleeping. Every time I tried to close my eyes, I had the feeling that someone was standing at the end of the bed, silently watching me. On the third night in dormitory number 7, I decided to record in my room to verify what I had heard. I put my phone in the corner of the room, turned on the recording mode, and lay down on the bed, trying to fall asleep. But sleep did not come. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. Around 3 in the morning, when everything around me had fallen silent, I heard a noise. At first, it was just the gentle creaking of the upper bunk, but then the noise turned into slow footsteps. The footsteps echoed in the small room, each step steady and heavy. I did not dare to sit up, nor did I dare to look up. All my senses were strained, trying to distinguish where the noise was coming from. Then I heard whispering. Not one voice, but several voices at the same time, like a strange choir. The whispers were indistinct, as if they came from another world. The next morning, I opened the recording. At first, it was just a small noise. Then suddenly, a voice rang out. "Go, before it's too late." The voice was soft but haunting. I listened to it over and over again. But each time, my fear grew. I showed the recording to a friend. She turned pale, her voice stuttering. That's Emily's voice. I had never heard of this name. But according to my friend, Emily was a student who had lived in room 207. She had disappeared without a trace last winter, and no one had found any clues. I began to learn more about Emily. Old documents in the school library showed that she had kept a diary about strange phenomena in her room. Whispers, strange footprints, and the feeling of being watched all the time. The more I learned, the more I realized that I was walking the same path Emily had walked. And if I didn't do something, I might be the next person to disappear from dormitory number 7. After learning about Emily, I couldn't stop thinking about her. What happened to Emily might be repeating itself to me, and it made me feel like I was walking on thin ice. With every step I took, that could lead to a fall into the abyss. I started recording everything that happened in my room, from the smallest noises to the strange phenomena that I couldn't explain. Every night, I left my phone recording, placed a camera in front of my door, and wrote short notes in my diary. Every morning, I rewinded the recording, reviewed the video, but nothing was clear. Whispers sometimes appeared, but they were small and faint, like a dream. Shadows appeared and disappeared in the video, but not clearly enough to prove anything. One night, While I was sleeping, I felt someone watching me. It felt like a pair of eyes were drilling into my back. Every beat of my heart was like a drum in the dark night. I opened my eyes, but didn't dare to move. The room was in darkness. Only the dim light from the window shone in, creating dancing shadows on the wall. Then I saw it. A black figure stood in the corner of the room, near the wardrobe. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. The eyes were white, without pupils, standing out in the dark night. I didn't dare to blink, afraid that if I looked away, it would come closer. I don't know how much time passed. I only knew that I had fainted in extreme fear. When I woke up, the sun was high in the sky. The room was bright, as if everything was just a nightmare. But on the floor, the small footprints leading from my bed to the door were still there, as clear evidence that last night was not just a hallucination. I decided to see the dorm manager. When I asked about Emily and what had happened, he looked at me with tired eyes, then said in a whisper, "She was like you, always hearing noises and seeing shadows. Then one day, she disappeared. The police came, but they couldn't find anything. It was as if she had never existed." "Then why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" I almost shouted. He shook his head, his thin hands shaking. "I told everyone before you, but no one listened to me. And then they disappeared too." I left the manager's office with more fear than ever. I knew that I couldn't stay here much longer, but leaving wasn't as easy as I thought. My room door was often locked from the inside. The key mysteriously disappeared. Every time I packed my things, my suitcase would flip over, clothes scattered everywhere, as if someone wanted to stop me. That night, I decided not to sleep. I sat on my bed, the light on and the recorder still running. The room was eerily quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on my desk. I focused on the sounds around me, trying to detect anything out of the ordinary. Around 3 in the morning, when everything was quiet, the whispering began. At first it was just a murmur, like wind blowing through a crack in the door, but then the voice became clearer. "Go, before it's too late." It was Emily's voice. I recognized it from the recording earlier. It seemed to come from somewhere far away or very close, right next to my ear. I turned my head to look around the room, but there was no one there. But I could feel her presence, like a mist around me. "Emily, are you here?" I asked softly, my voice trembling. There was no answer, but the lights in the room flickered, as if she were trying to communicate. I mustered up the courage to ask again, "What do you want me to do?" A cold wind blew through, causing the curtains to flutter. Papers flew across the desk, and as they fell to the floor, I saw scribbled words appear on the white wall. "Leave here." Without any further indication, I knew that I needed to leave dormitory number 7 immediately. But when I reached the door, it wouldn't open. The old wooden door was stuck, as if held by an invisible force. I pounded on the door screaming, but no one heard. The whispering grew louder. Many voices joined together, forming a terrifying melody. Shadows began to appear around the room, hovering like ghosts that couldn't be released. I backed away, falling onto the bed, eyes fixed on the door. "Please let me go," I begged, tears streaming down my face. And then, in a split second, everything went silent. The lights came back on. The door opened automatically, The space returned to normal, but I knew that this was just the calm before the storm. I needed to leave before it was too late, before I became another shadow in dormitory number 7. After the words "leave her" appeared on the wall, I knew that I couldn't wait any longer. The next morning, I packed my things, trying to stuff everything into my suitcase as quickly as possible. My hands were shaking. Each finger seemed to no longer belong to me. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw my eyes were dark, sunken, like bottomless pits. But when I was about to open the door to leave, it wouldn't budge. The door seemed glued to the frame, no matter how hard I pulled. I felt like someone was standing on the other side, holding the doorknob, not letting me out. Cold sweat was pouring down. My breaths became ragged. "Please let me go," I shouted, but only received an echo in the empty room. The space around me suddenly became strange. The lights flickered as if someone was playing with the switch. Dark shadows began to appear all over the room, wandering back and forth like ghosts that could not be released. I backed away, fell onto the bed, eyes fixed on the door. The whispers rang out, clearer than ever. Many voices mixed together, forming a terrifying melody. "Stay, stay forever." I quickly pulled out my phone, calling Michael, the only friend I thought could help me at this moment. When the phone rang, I heard a familiar voice ringing in my ear. But it was not Michael's voice. "You can't escape." The voice was hoarse, as if coming from deep within the darkness. The phone fell to the floor, the screen flickering and then going dark. I crawled back, my back hitting the cold wall. The shadows continued to hover, getting closer and closer. Their white eyes stared at me, unblinking. I felt like I was being sucked into an abyss where light could not reach. A tall, shadowy figure came straight towards me. I closed my eyes tightly, my hand clutching the necklace my mother had given me, like a final talisman. "Please, don't." Suddenly, everything became silent. No more whispers, no more shadows. I opened my eyes. The room was lit. Everything returned to normal. The door to the room was ajar, as if nothing had happened. I gasped, every cell in my body trembling. But I knew that this was just the calm before the storm. I need to get out of here now. I rushed out of the room, running as fast as I could through the long, dark hallway. Each step I took echoed, mixing with the other footsteps chasing after me. I didn't dare look back, didn't dare stop for even a second. Every time I blinked, I saw black shadows pass by the corner of my eye, moving as fast as the wind. When I reached the ground floor, the door was locked. I banged on the glass door, screaming for help, but outside, the town was in darkness. Not a soul in sight. The houses opposite were like lifeless corpses. The windows were black like empty eyes. "No one heard you." A whisper sounded right behind me. I turned around and saw the largest black shadow standing right in the middle of the hallway. It was tall, its shape distorted as if its body was twisted. Its white eyes looked at me without emotion, just absolute emptiness. I ran into the kitchen, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. My hand touched the kitchen knife, cold. As the shadow approached, I swung the knife at it, but the blade only cut through the air. The shadow was like smoke, appearing and disappearing, then suddenly appearing right in front of me. I fell backwards onto the floor, the knife flying from my hand. The room darkened. The darkness engulfed me. The whispers turned into screams, shrill and painful. I felt cold hands grasp my neck, squeezing. The air was running out, my vision was fading, Suddenly, a powerful light shone in. The kitchen door swung open, and Michael stood there, eyes wide with horror. He rushed in and pulled me away from the black smoke that was engulfing me. Not knowing where I got the strength from, I jumped up and ran out of the dormitory with Michael. We ran out into the night sky. The street lights shone, bringing the first sense of safety in days. As we stood across the street, looking back at Dormitory 7, I saw the shadowy figure standing by the second-floor window, its white eyes still watching us. Michael pulled me away, neither of us saying a word until we left that town forever. Later, when I tried to tell my story, no one believed me. People said that Dormitory 7 had long been abandoned. No one had ever lived there, but I knew the truth. I knew that the house was still there, waiting for the next victims. And every time I closed my eyes, I still saw those white eyes, still heard the whispers in the dark. I could never truly escape Dormitory 7. Story 3. The woman standing outside the window. When I moved to Boston, I thought it would be a chance to start over. The city felt both old and new, with its cobblestone streets and skyscrapers. I rented a small apartment on the third floor of an old building in Beacon Hill. It had large windows that looked out onto a narrow alley behind me, where sunlight only filtered in for a few hours a day. The apartment was old but cozy. The wooden floors creaked as I walked, and the thick walls made me feel safe and isolated from the outside world. I started a new job at a small bookstore nearby, where I could indulge my passion for reading and have a quiet space to think. At first, things went smoothly. I cleaned the apartment, rearranged the furniture, and figured out how to create a comfortable reading nook by the window. But then, from the second week on, I started to feel that something was wrong. Every time it started to get dark, I felt like someone was staring at me from outside the window. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just being too sensitive because I was living alone in a new city. But the feeling became more and more obvious. Sometimes, I heard small noises outside, like light footsteps on the cobblestone alley. Whenever I pulled the curtains open to look, all I saw was thick darkness and the yellow street lights shining on the wet ground. One night, while I was sitting in an armchair near the window reading a book, I felt a chill down my spine. Suddenly, I looked up and saw a blurry figure standing outside the window. It was the figure of a woman, her long hair hanging down, her pale face pressed against the glass. Her eyes were empty, staring at me without blinking. I screamed, jerked back from the chair, and fell to the floor. When I looked back up, the figure had disappeared. The window was still tightly closed, no sign that anyone had been there. My heart was pounding, my hands and feet were shaking, but I tried to reassure myself that it was probably just a tired hallucination. From then on, I started closing the curtains every night. But that didn't make the uneasy feeling go away. Every time I walked past the window, I always felt like someone was standing right outside, just a few centimeters away from me. Sometimes, I heard a light tap on the glass, very soft but enough to freeze me in place. I didn't dare tell anyone about this. Every time I went out, I felt the neighbors' eyes looking at me strangely, as if they knew something that I didn't. My apartment was gradually becoming a trap, and I was the prey being hunted by an invisible entity. But I knew, to find out the truth, I had to face my fear. And that fateful night came when I decided to open the curtains and look straight into the darkness. That night, I sat on the bed. The lights in the room were off. Only the dim light from the street lamp shining through the gaps in the curtains remained. I had mentally prepared myself to face whatever was coming. My hand held the necklace my mother had given me tightly, like a talisman. Time seemed to drag on endlessly, each passing second heavy and threatening. Then I heard a light tap on the glass. 3 regular taps, soft but clear in the quiet night. My heart was pounding, each beat as if it wanted to escape my chest. I slowly pulled the curtain open, the light from the street lamp illuminating part of the window. But there was nothing there. I breathed a sigh of relief, but as soon as I let the curtain down, the tap sounded again. This time, louder, more urgent. I threw the curtain wide open, my eyes staring at the cold glass. And then, from the darkness, her face appeared. So close, I could see the blue veins on her pale skin. Her eyes were blank as she stared at me, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. I stepped back, my foot hitting the chair, knocking it to the floor. The sound echoed in the quiet space, but the face outside the window did not disappear. She just stood there, motionless, like a creepy wax statue. I heard whispers in my head, not from her mouth, but from somewhere around her, spreading like mist. Get out. Come to me. I shook my head, trying to clear the sounds, but the harder I tried, the louder the whispers became. I began to hear footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing invisibly. My small apartment became a terrifying maze, where every corner was filled with darkness. I ran to the front door, my hands shaking as I searched for my keys. But the lock refused to open, as if someone was holding it from the outside. I felt a cold breath from behind, a whisper right next to my ear. When I turned around, she was standing right in front of me, no longer separated by the glass. She raised her hand, her long, bony fingers touching my shoulder. The coldness spread throughout my body, paralyzing all consciousness. I fell to the floor, my eyes still wide open, looking at that lifeless face. Everything around me gradually faded, leaving only the white eyes staring straight into my mind, pulling me into the endless darkness. When I woke up, the morning light had filled the room. The apartment returned to normal, as if everything was just a dream. But I knew it was not an illusion, because on the window there were still faint streaks of mist, imprinted with long, skinny fingers. The following days, I lived in a constant obsession. Every time it got dark, I felt my apartment become colder than usual. The air seemed to thicken, and my breathing became difficult. I tried to turn on all the lights in the house, but the pale yellow light could not dispel the darkness that crept into every corner. I started to leave my phone recording every night, placing it near the window where I had seen the woman's figure. The next morning, when I played the recording again, I heard strange sounds. At first, it was just the sound of the wind whistling through the crack in the door, but then whispers began to appear. Her voice, gentle but cold, seemed to come from another world. Get out. Come here. Every time I listened to the recording, I felt more and more drawn into a vortex with no way out. My dreams became chaotic. I found myself standing outside the window, looking inside the apartment. The figure in my dream had no face, just an empty shadow. but her eyes were as white as hers. One night, as I was sitting on the bed, the room lights suddenly went out. The room was plunged into absolute darkness. I didn't dare move, only hearing my own heavy breathing. Then there was a knock on the door. 3 soft knocks that echoed in the silence. I didn't know if the sound came from the front door or the window, only that it was very close. So close that I could feel the cold air blowing through the crack in the door. I slowly stood up. Each step on the wooden floor made an eerie creaking sound. When I pulled the curtains, no one was there. But on the frosted glass, there were long, skinny finger marks, as if someone had been standing there for a long time, just to look inside. I began to learn about this building. I asked the neighbors, but most of them avoided me or made excuses that they were busy. An elderly woman who lived downstairs finally spoke to me. She told me that my apartment had once belonged to a woman named Margaret. She lived alone, rarely interacted with anyone, and always stood outside the window after dark. "Is she dead?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The old woman nodded, her eyes clouded, as if looking into a distant memory. "One winter night, people saw her fall from the window into the alley behind. No one knows why, but some say they saw her standing outside the window, looking into her own apartment from the outside." My heart stopped. What I saw was not a hallucination. That shadow really existed, and perhaps she had not left yet. After learning the truth about Margaret, I couldn't sleep anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her white eyes staring at me from outside the window. I tried to move, but every time I packed my things, the door to my room locked automatically. My suitcase flipped over, and my clothes scattered everywhere as if someone was blocking it. One night, I decided to face my fear. I sat on a chair near the window. All the lights in the room were off. My hand clutched the necklace, my mouth mumbling prayers. I opened the curtains, the light from the street lamp shining in, creating dim shadows on the floor. Then she appeared. Margaret's figure stood right outside the window, her face pressed against the glass. Her white eyes had no pupils. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I didn't back away anymore. I looked straight at her, trying to stay calm. "What do you want?" I asked softly, my voice echoing in the quiet space. The shadow did not answer. Instead, the glass was gradually covered with streaks of mist. Each line appeared on the glass, scrawled in cold. "Stay with me." Suddenly, the room became cold. My breath turned into white smoke in the air. I felt a heavy pressure on my chest, as if someone was squeezing my heart. Everything around me began to distort. The walls seemed to shift, creating a long, endless hallway. I could no longer control my body. My feet automatically moved towards the window. Each step echoed with the creaking sound of the wooden floor, mixed with the whispers that grew louder and louder. "Stay. Don't go." When I touched the glass, I felt a chill that pierced my bones. Margaret's hand slowly pressed against the other side, her fingers matching mine through the thin glass. It felt like a cold current ran through my body, pulling me into another reality. The street lights flickered, then went out. Everything was dark. And in that darkness, I found myself standing outside the window, looking into the apartment. Inside, I saw another figure of myself, sitting motionless on the chair, eyes wide and lifeless. And beside me, Margaret was smiling. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Outside the window, I was just a shadow, forever trapped between two worlds, never to be myself again. After that night, I knew that I could not stay in this apartment for another second. Every corner of this place was soaked with fear and darkness. I started packing, trying to stuff everything into my suitcase in a hurry. But it seemed like the room did not want me to leave. Every time I closed my suitcase, it would swing open, clothes spilling all over the floor. Sometimes, it felt like someone was pulling me back, holding me in this room. I called Michael, my only close friend left in Boston. I told him everything, my voice trembling. Michael was silent for a long time, then said, "I'll be right there. Don't do anything. Just stay in your room. Don't open the door for anyone but me." I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, my eyes fixed on the door. The lights in the room flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I tried not to look at the window, but it felt like her white eyes were still watching me from outside. There was a knock on the door, soft but enough to freeze me. I opened my mouth to ask, "Michael, is that you?" But there was no answer. The knock came again, louder, more urgent. I swallowed, clutching the necklace, as if it could protect me from the darkness that was enveloping me. The door slowly opened, but no one was outside. The cold wind from the hallway blew in, carrying a musty, stale smell. The darkness from outside seemed to flood into the room, swallowing all the light. I tried to stand up, but my legs felt paralyzed. Whispers began to ring out, not from outside the window anymore, but from everywhere in the room. "Stay. Don't go. Stay forever." Black shadows began to appear from hidden corners, from under the bed, from behind the curtains. The shadows moved slowly, step by step closer to me. White eyes flashed in the darkness like hundreds of ghostly candles. I backed away until my back hit the wall, with no way out. When the largest shadow stood right in front of me, I felt the chill from it. A skinny hand with long fingers reached out, touching my face. My senses were numb, as if the shadow was sucking the life out of me. At that moment, the front door opened and light flooded in from the hallway. Michael rushed in, pulling me away from the cold hands. He shouted something that I couldn't hear, but the shadow retreated, as if disappearing into thin air. Michael helped me out, each step heavy and hazy. I don't remember how I left the apartment, only that when I woke up, I was in Michael's car, the daylight shining through the car windows, dispelling all fear. I left Boston soon after. Michael helped me find a new apartment in the suburbs, away from Beacon Hill. The apartment was small but cozy, with light flooding every corner. I began to feel safer, slowly returning to normal life, but the fear never really went away. Every night, I still heard whispers in the wind. Sometimes, I saw a shadow pass out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I told myself that it was just a psychological effect, that the darkness could not follow me forever. One night, as I sat in an armchair by the window, I felt someone watching me. The feeling was all too familiar, like a terrifying loop. I slowly turned my head and saw her silhouette. Her eyes were white, her face pale, pressed against the window. But this time, she was inside. I couldn't scream, couldn't move. She just stood there, staring at me with empty eyes. I heard a whisper in my head, not from her mouth, but from somewhere deep in my mind. "You can't escape. The light in the room began to fade, darkness spreading everywhere. I felt the coldness, the thin hands gripping my shoulders, squeezing. Everything around me began to distort, like a never-ending nightmare. When I opened my eyes, I found myself standing outside the window, looking into the apartment. Inside, I saw another form of myself, sitting motionless on the chair, eyes lifeless, and beside me, she was still smiling. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Outside the window, I was just a shadow, forever trapped between two worlds, never to be myself again. And every night, when the night falls, I still stand there, staring at the people living in the apartment, waiting for someone to notice my presence. But no one ever does. Story 4. Crying in the Forest. I have always loved nature, and the Canadian countryside is the perfect place to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. When I heard about the ancient forest near the small town of Pine Hollow, I couldn't resist the urge to experience a weekend camping there. The image of the vast birch forests, clear lakes, and deep blue skies appeared in my mind like a peaceful picture. I prepared carefully for the trip. My backpack was filled with camping gear, tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, canned food, and a favorite book. My little jeep rolled down the red dirt road. The curves seemed to lead deeper into another world. As I got deeper into the forest, the phone signal became weaker and weaker, then disappeared completely. That didn't bother me. On the contrary, I enjoyed this isolation. When I reached the edge of the forest, the sun was starting to set. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating shimmering streaks of light on the ground. I chose an open space near the lake to pitch my tent. The lake was calm, its surface reflecting the red sunset sky, looking like a giant mirror. After setting up the tent and lighting the fire, I sat down on a folding chair, holding a cup of hot coffee, admiring the peaceful, natural scenery. The sound of the wind blowing through the leaves, the sound of the water gently lapping at the shore, and the crackling of the fire made me feel truly relaxed. I read a few pages of the book, but my eyes gradually became heavy. This peaceful feeling was like a sleeping pill. When night fell completely, I crawled into my sleeping bag in the tent. The surrounding space was plunged into pitch black darkness, with only the dim light from the small fire outside the tent remaining. The sounds of the forest at night were completely different from those of the day. Strange sounds rang out from all directions. Owls, the sound of wind whistling through the branches, and the rustling of leaves under the feet of invisible creatures. I began to drift off to sleep, but then a strange sound pulled me back to reality. It was crying. It was faint at first, like a distant sob. I lay still, holding my breath as I listened. The crying became clearer, each sound echoing through the silence. It had a tone of pain and loneliness. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Someone must be lost in the woods, or worse, in need of help. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the tent opening. The dim light only illuminated the nearby trees, casting eerie shadows that danced across the ground. "Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the darkness. But all I got in response was a steady cry, echoing from deep within the forest. There were no footsteps, no human sounds, just the sound of crying, like a tape loop. The crying continued to echo in the quiet space, so regular and strange that it made my skin crawl. I tried to adjust the flashlight, the weak light shining through the tall trees, creating dancing shadows on the ground. The air around me became colder. The mist from the lake's surface began to spread, wrapping around my feet like thin wisps of smoke. I took a few steps towards the deep forest, each step creating a small rustling sound under my feet. The crying seemed to change, sometimes far, sometimes near, as if the person crying was moving in the darkness. I tried to calm myself, but my heart was pounding so hard that I could hear every beat in my ears. "Is anyone there?" I called again, my voice swallowed by the thick darkness. But this time, the crying stopped. The sudden silence made me stop, my feet frozen to the ground. Around me, nothing moved. Even the sound of the wind disappeared. Everything became eerily quiet. Suddenly, a soft sound rang out behind me. Soft footsteps like a child's. I turned around, my flashlight shining into the empty space. But as the light passed through a large tree trunk, I caught a glimpse of a short, dark figure, only waist high, lurking in the darkness. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It could have been a wild animal, or worse, a real lost child. But my intuition told me that this was not normal. The shadow moved too quickly and made no sound other than a mysterious cry. I took a few steps back, but my feet felt heavy as if they were pinned to the ground. It felt like hundreds of invisible eyes were staring at me from between the black trunks. My breathing became heavy, each breath escaping into the cold air in a white mist. Then, from the darkness, the cry rang out again. But this time, the sound came from right next to me. I flinched, the flashlight flickering and then going out. The darkness swallowed me, leaving only the cry echoing in my head. It no longer had the tone of pain, but became distorted, like the cold laughter of an invisible entity. I closed my eyes tightly. All my senses were on edge. My hand trembled as I held the pocket knife in my pocket. I didn't dare open my eyes, didn't dare move, just praying that when I opened my eyes, everything would disappear, and I would still be safe in my tent. But when I opened my eyes, in front of me, in the pitch black, were two white eyes staring straight at me. Eyes without pupils, just two empty white spots, reflecting the faint light from the flashlight that had fallen to the ground. The crying stopped, replaced by a whisper, soft but haunting. "Stay with me." I froze in place, the white eyes in the darkness still staring at me. Those eyes had no emotion, not even blinking, just two bright white spots in the thick night. It felt like all the warmth in my body had been drained, leaving only coldness and fear seeping into every cell. "Stay with me?" The whisper rang out like the wind blowing through the crack of the door, gentle but haunting. I couldn't make out where the voice came from, only knowing that it echoed in my head, each word eating into my mind. The small black figure was still standing there, the white eyes not leaving me for even a second. My hand clenched the folding knife in my pocket, my palm cold and sweaty. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, but my throat was choked, as if an invisible hand was choking me. All my senses were on edge, feeling every erratic heartbeat, every heavy, ragged breath. In that moment, the shadow began to move, not walking, nor crawling, but gliding, its small feet not touching the ground. Every time it passed, the air became colder. The shadows of the surrounding trees seemed to lean towards it, as if the entire forest was bowing to the shadow's presence. What do you want? I finally found my voice. But the sound that came out was not like a normal voice, but like a faint whisper in the middle of a nightmare. The shadow did not answer. Instead, it stopped just a few steps away from me. I could see its shape more clearly. A child, long hair matted, skin as pale as candle wax. Its lips moved, but still no sound came out. Suddenly, it raised its hand, its long pointed fingers pointing straight at me. At that moment, a strong wind blew, and my flashlight turned on again. The bright light shone on the black shadow, and I saw it disappear before my eyes, dissipating like smoke. But the cold feeling was still there, as if the black shadow was just hiding in the darkness, waiting for the next opportunity. I had no choice but to run. I turned around, my legs heavy, but still trying to move away from that place, step by step. Each step echoed in the night, mixed with my heavy breathing. But no matter how fast I ran, those light footsteps still followed, not closer or further, just a few steps away from me. When my legs could no longer bear it, I collapsed onto the wet ground. The flashlight fell, the weak light shining on the leaves, creating dancing shadows like lost souls. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring up at the pitch-black sky, feeling as if the entire forest was swallowing me. Stay with me. The voice rang out again, this time right next to my ear. I turned my head and saw the small black figure squatting beside me, its white eyes only a few centimeters from my face. Its cold hand touched my cheek, feeling like thousands of needles piercing my flesh. I couldn't move. My body seemed frozen under its gaze. Suddenly, it grabbed my leg, its skinny fingers squeezing tightly, so hard that I felt pain. I tried to pull away, but its hand felt like it had thorns. Every movement caused my flesh to tear. Blood began to seep into the wet ground. "Where are you going? Don't go!" The black figure screamed, its voice distorted, both like a child's and a hoarse old man's. Its cold breath blew against my face, its black lips moving as if swallowing all the sounds around it. Its small mouth opened wide, wider than usual, like a bottomless black hole. It screamed at me, a shrill, angry scream. The space around me seemed to shake. The trees swayed despite the lack of wind. The ground beneath my feet shook as if it were breaking apart. In that moment, I realized that I was not just facing a ghost, but an ancient entity, carrying centuries of resentment and despair. I screamed, my screams mingling with its own, forming a terrifying sound that echoed throughout the forest. As the flashlight's light faded, the black figure leaned closer, its cold lips touching my ear, whispering words I could not understand. The world around me faded. Everything became distant and blurry. Only the white eyes and the echoing cry in the darkness remained. I don't remember how I escaped that forest. When I woke up, I found myself lying on an old bed in the forest ranger's wooden house. The dim morning light shone through the dusty window, creating weak rays of light in the dark room. The forest ranger, an old man with tired eyes and a wrinkled face, sat in the corner of the room, his hands trembling as he held a cup of hot tea. When he saw me awake, he only nodded slightly, saying nothing. I could feel the tension in the air, as if no words could describe what had happened. How long have you been here?" My voice was hoarse, each word a hiss through my throat. 3 days. The old man replied, his eyes looking out the window, where the forest was still silent under the mist. 3 days. I couldn't believe it. Remembering what I had experienced in the forest, I felt a chill run down my spine. The small black figure, the white eyes, and the piercing scream echoed in my head like a stuck tape, playing over and over again. I have to get out of here, I muttered, my legs still shaking as I tried to stand. But as I stepped out of bed, the wooden floor beneath me creaked. The same sound as the footsteps that night. I fell to my knees, my hands clutching the edge of the bed, my breathing rapid. The old man remained seated, unfazed by my reaction. That forest, not everyone makes it out. You're lucky. What about the others? I asked, my voice rising, almost desperate. No one came back, he whispered, his eyes seemingly lost in a distant memory. They disappeared, as if they had never existed. I felt my blood freeze. The images of the black shadow, the crying, and the cold hand squeezing my leg came back to me. I had to leave now. I packed my things, but when I opened my backpack, everything inside was wet and covered in mud. The photos I took in the forest were blurred, leaving only faint black streaks. But what made me shiver was that in every photo, in the far corner, there was always a small black figure standing looking toward the camera. Its white eyes stood out from the trees, like a reminder that I could never truly escape it. I didn't say goodbye to the old forest ranger. When I walked out of the cabin, he was still sitting there, his cloudy eyes staring into space. I felt like he had been there for a long time, and maybe would be there forever, waiting for others to enter the forest and never return. My jeep was still parked at the entrance to the woods, but the doors were wide open, the seats covered in mud. I got in, my hands shaking as I inserted the key into the ignition. As the engine started, I felt like I was waking up from a nightmare. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw white eyes reflected in the back seat. I screamed, spun around, but the back seat was empty. Cold sweat poured out. I tried to calm myself, stepped on the gas, and drove out of the woods. The farther I got from the woods, the lighter the air became. But every time I passed a mirror or a car window, I saw those white eyes looking at me. I left Pine Hollow that day, driving all night back to the city. I tried to forget everything, but no matter what I did, the darkness and the crying haunted my sleep. I found myself lost in that forest, my feet dragging on the damp ground, and a voice whispering in my ear, "Stay with me." Every night I heard a knock on the door. At first it was 3 soft knocks, but as time went on, the knocks became louder, as if someone was trying to break the door down. I didn't dare open the door, didn't dare look through the crack in the window. But I knew out there, in the darkness, the white eyes were still watching me, waiting for me to return to that pathless forest. Story 5. Stranger in the House. When I moved to Hamilton, Canada, I thought it would be a fresh start. After a divorce and job loss, I needed a place to start over. The small house on the outskirts of town, with a small garden and a white picket fence, looked peaceful. The landlord said it had been empty for a long time, but there was no reason for it. The rent was so cheap, I thought I had won the lottery. At first, everything seemed fine. I spent a week cleaning, rearranging the furniture, and making my new home feel cozy. The Hamilton autumn afternoons were pleasant, the pale sunlight streaming through the large windows in the living room, creating soft shadows and light on the wooden floors. It began to feel like a real home. But then, strange things started to happen. At first, they were just small things that I easily ignored. Things in the house were often in disarray, like the chair I had placed near the window that had been pushed into the corner of the room. Sometimes I couldn't find my house key, and then it would appear in strange places like the refrigerator or under the sink. I thought I was just stressed and tired. I told myself that everything could be explained. But then I started hearing noises at night. Slow footsteps on the wooden floor, whispers coming from the hallway, and sometimes a gentle knock on the door in the middle of the night. Every time I went to check, the dark hallway was still empty, only the lights flickering as if they wanted to say something. One night, while I was lying in bed, I heard soft breathing right next to me. It was steady, as if someone was lying with me under the covers. I froze, not daring to move. It felt like if I moved, something terrible would happen. I turned on the night light. The pale yellow light dispelled the darkness in the room. There was no one there, but the blanket beside me was dented, as if someone had been lying there for a long time. Cold sweat ran down my spine. I didn't dare turn off the light again. All night, I sat hugging my knees on the bed, eyes wide open, staring at the empty space beside me. The next morning, I decided to install a security camera in the house. I needed to know if someone had sneaked into the house while I was sleeping. Cameras were installed in the hallway, living room, and bedroom. I turned on the recording mode all night long, hoping to find an answer. The first few nights, nothing unusual happened. I gradually felt more relieved, until one morning when I checked the recorded video. At 3 a.m., the camera in the living room recorded the image of a figure gliding across the screen. A blurry black figure, tall and thin, moved from the hallway to the kitchen. I rewinded the video over and over, but the image was too blurry to recognize anything. I felt something was wrong. I locked all the doors, checked all the locks, and tried to convince myself that it was just a camera problem. But the next night, I heard a clanking noise in the kitchen. Dishes clanking, drawers opening and closing. I picked up my phone, opened the security camera app, and stared at the screen. The black and white image from the camera appeared before my eyes. The kitchen was empty, but I could still hear the noise. Then suddenly, the shadow appeared again, right in front of the camera. It stood still, looking straight into the lens. I couldn't see its face, but it felt like its invisible eyes were looking straight at me, through the phone screen. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. The shadow didn't move, just stood there, silent and creepy. Then the lights in the kitchen started to flicker. The image on the screen flickered, and then the camera went black. The phone screen went black, and all the sounds in the house disappeared. I sat there, in the darkness of my bedroom, phone in hand, heart pounding in my chest. That shadow was still in my house. And worse, I had no idea where it was. I couldn't sleep after that night. The image of the black figure standing in front of the security camera, its invisible eyes staring at me, haunted my mind. I sat on the bed, the light from the yellow night light creating strange shadows on the wall. Every sound in the house became too clear, from the ticking of the clock to the wind whistling through the cracks in the window. I jumped up, opened my phone, and checked the video from the camera again. The screen was black. The camera app couldn't connect. I tried to check the other cameras, but there was no signal. It felt like someone had disabled them, and I was left alone with the darkness and fear. I tried to calm down. Maybe there was a problem with the electrical system in the house. Yes, just check the power and restart the camera. I walked out of the bedroom, the light from the hallway flickering as if it was about to burn out. A chill crept across my skin, each step creaking against the old wooden floor. When I entered the living room, everything was strangely silent. There was no wind, no clock, just absolute silence. The room was dark, the light from outside through the window casting long shadows across the floor. I walked to the electrical box in the corner of the room, opened the cover, and checked the fuses. Everything was normal, no sign of a faulty electrical system. It must be a technical error, I whispered, my voice echoing in the empty space. Just then, a soft sound came from behind me. Footsteps were slow and steady, as if someone was walking down the hallway. I turned around, but there was no one there. The bedroom door was still wide open, the darkness inside like a black mouth waiting to swallow me. I backed away, my back against the cold wall. My heart was pounding, each beat ringing in my ears. I picked up the phone, turned on the flashlight, and shined it straight into the hallway. The weak light only reached a few meters, creating patches of dim light and darkness. I swallowed, slowly approaching the bedroom door. As I got closer, I realized that the door was not just open, but it was gradually opening wider, as if someone was standing behind the door, gently pushing it. The flashlight flickered. The darkness in the room seemed to move. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and pushed the door open. No one was there. The bedroom was empty. Everything was still in the place I remembered. But the feeling that someone had just been here, right in this room, was still there. I turned around, about to step outside, when I heard the window creak. The flashlight shone to the corner of the room, where the window was slightly open. The thin curtain swayed gently, even though there was no wind. I stepped forward, my hand shaking as I pulled the curtain open. It was dark outside, the small path in front of the house completely deserted. But just as I let the curtain fall, a light knock sounded from the other side of the window. 3 regular knocks, soft but clear. I jumped back, my foot tripping over the edge of the bed and sending me sprawling on the floor. The flashlight fell from my hand, rolling across the wooden floor, its light swirling in the darkness. I crawled back, eyes glued to the window. The darkness outside seemed to thicken, covering everything, leaving only faint silhouettes to pass by. Then, from the corner of the room, I heard a whisper. A soft but haunting whisper, like wind blowing through a crack in the door, but with the tone of a voice. Don't go. Stay. With me. I screamed, groping for the flashlight. The light turned on, shining straight into the corner of the room, and I saw it. A small black figure, only waist high, stood still in the corner, its white eyes without pupils staring at me. Its mouth moved, repeating words that I couldn't make out clearly. The shadow began to move, not walking, but floating above the ground. It approached me, inch by inch, its white eyes unblinking. I tried to back away, but my back was against the wall. There was no escape. The light from the flashlight faded. Darkness began to envelop me. The whispers became louder, like hundreds of voices echoing in my head at once. I felt the cold air on my face. The shadow's skinny hand reached out, touching my shoulder. The coldness was piercing. All my senses were numb. And then the shadow leaned close to my face. Its black lips moved, and a piercing scream rang out, piercing the silence. Everything around me suddenly disappeared, leaving only the darkness and that terrifying scream forever echoing in my mind. After that piercing scream, I woke up on the cold floor. The weak morning light shone through the window, bringing a bit of warmth, but not enough to dispel the cold feeling from last night. I didn't know how long I'd been unconscious, only that when I opened my eyes, everything around me was still terrifyingly silent. I sat up, my body aching, as if I had just gone through a physical and mental nightmare. I didn't dare look at the corner of the room where the black figure had appeared. My mind tried to convince me that it was all an illusion, but the traces on the floor told a different story. A trail of dried blood stretched from where I fell to the bedroom door, as if I had been dragged across the floor without realizing it. I left the room, my legs shaking as I walked to the bathroom. I needed to wash my face, needed to calm down. When I looked in the mirror, I was startled. On the glass, scribbled lines appeared, dark red like blood. Die. Those two words seemed to scream, each stroke as if written by trembling fingers, leaving long, blotchy marks. My hand was cold when it touched the mirror. Dark red liquid stuck to my fingertips, viscous and cold. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. It was real blood. Where did the blood come from? Who wrote these words? I stepped back, my back against the cold tiled wall, as if the whole house was trying to swallow me. At that moment, the mirror began to fog up. Even though there was no steam in the room, the glass surface became cloudy, and from within the fog, other words appeared. Stay with me forever, I screamed, running out of the bathroom. My footsteps echoed through the narrow hallway, as if they were chasing me from behind. I slipped, my body hitting the floor hard, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the horror in my heart. I crawled back, my eyes staring at the bathroom door that was slowly opening. A black hand reached out, fingers long and sharp like claws. Then came white eyes, empty and cold. The small black figure crawled out of the bathroom, its body twisted, moving like a spider. It crawled on the wall, on the ceiling, its eyes never leaving me. Its lips moved, not making a sound, but I could hear the words echoing in my head. Die. Die. I felt my body being squeezed, as if thousands of invisible strings were pulling me to the floor. The air became heavy, every breath was labored. The black figure crept closer, its white eyes like endless pits. I saw my own reflection in those eyes. A pale figure, lips parted but no sound came out. The shadow reached out, its cold hand touching my neck. It felt like every vein in my body froze. Its breath fanned against my face, cold and rotten. It tilted its head, its mouth opened wider than usual. From its throat came a screeching sound like metal rubbing against metal. You will never leave. I didn't know where the strength came from, but in a moment of desperation, I swung my hand to push it away. The shadow retreated, its body writhing like a shadow caught in a flashlight. I jumped up, running as fast as I could out of the hallway, my feet barely touching the ground. When I reached the main door, my hands trembled as I turned the knob, but it wouldn't open. The door seemed to be locked from the outside. All my efforts only made it shake hopelessly. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one heard. From behind, the footsteps slowly echoed again, each step steady and heavy. Each step was like a hammer hitting my nerves. The black figure appeared at the end of the hallway, its white eyes staring at me without blinking. It didn't move, just stood there, but its presence was enough to make me feel like I was being suffocated. I turned, grabbed a nearby chair, and slammed it against the window. The glass shattered, shards flying everywhere. I climbed through the window, the sharp glass cutting into my flesh, but I didn't feel any pain. As I rushed out of the house, the daylight greeted me like a warm embrace. I ran, not looking back, not knowing where I was going, just to get away from there, away from the white eyes and the bloody words on the mirror. But when I stopped to catch my breath, I looked down at my hands. On them, the dark red liquid was still sticky, running down each crack in my fingers. And in my head, the whisper still echoed, "You will never escape me." I ran out of that house, my feet not stopping, even though cold sweat soaked my shirt. The deserted streets of Hamilton stretched out before me, but I didn't feel safe. Every window, every corner seemed to hide white eyes staring at me. The whispers still echoed in my head, repeating like a ghostly song. "You will never escape me." I don't remember how far I walked, but when I stopped, my legs ached, my knees scraped from falling. I sat down on the sidewalk, my breath ragged and my eyes lost. A passerby stopped to ask if I was okay, but I just shook my head, speechless. How could I explain to anyone what I had just experienced? How could I tell them that there was a dark entity in that house that wanted to kill me? Finally, I found a small, old hotel, but safe enough. The receptionist looked at me suspiciously at my ragged appearance, but fortunately, they didn't ask any more questions. I went into my room, locked the door, and huddled in the corner of my bed. The dim yellow light in the room cast long shadows on the walls, and I tried not to look at them. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that small black figure, the white eyes, and the bloody words on the mirror. I turned on the lights, turned on the TV to make some noise, but everything just made me more nervous. Every little noise startled me. Every shadow on the wall made me think it had found me. At around 3 in the morning, when everything was quiet, I heard a knock on the door. 3 soft, steady knocks. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear each beat in my head. The knocking came again, louder this time, as if someone was trying to push the door open. "No, it can't be," I whispered, my voice so low, I wasn't sure if I'd actually made a sound. The door slowly opened, even though I'd locked it from the inside. There was no one outside, just a dark hallway, the flickering lights creating dim patches of light. But then, from within the darkness, white eyes appeared, hovering in space like 2 ghostly lights. The black figure crawled into the room, moving across the ceiling like a spider. It slid through the corners of the room, each step making a terrifying creaking sound. I couldn't take my eyes off it, mesmerized by those white eyes. My throat tightened, unable to scream, unable to move. It stopped on the ceiling, right above me. Its head tilted to one side, its black lips moving, and then, from that small mouth, a clear voice came out, but like hundreds of voices blending together. "You will die here." The shadow swooped down, its cold hand touching my neck. It felt like thousands of needles piercing my flesh, cold and numb. It tightened, each sharp finger digging deep into my skin, making me suffocate. The world around me blurred, leaving only that pale face occupying my entire vision. In a panic, I swung my hand. The small knife in my pocket popped out. I stabbed the shadow, not sure if I had touched it, but the grip on my neck suddenly disappeared. I fell to the floor, coughing, trying to catch my breath. When I looked up, the shadow had disappeared, but on the wall, in dark red blood, scrawled words appeared. There is no escape. I had no other choice. I left everything behind, ran out of the hotel and into the night. I don't remember how far I walked, but when morning came, I was on the edge of town, on the deserted road leading out of Hamilton. But even as I walked away from that house, the shadow followed me. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw those white eyes staring back at me. Every time I heard a knock on the door, I knew it was outside waiting. I moved to many places, but the whispers still echoed every night. You will never escape me. And every morning when I woke up, the words in blood appeared on the bathroom mirror, a reminder that this nightmare would never end. Story 6. Never-ending night. I moved to a small house in rural Canada in the middle of winter. The area was deep in a valley, surrounded by pine forests and winding dirt roads. The old wooden house, with its dark red tiled roof and old window frames, gave off a feeling of both warmth and darkness. I chose this place because I wanted to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, to find a quiet space to write a book. A sense of peace enveloped me as I sat in front of the fireplace, listening to the crackling of the firewood and watching the snow fall outside the window. However, from the very first days, I sensed that something was wrong. It all started on the third night. While I was sleeping, I was startled awake by a strange noise. At first, it was just the sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the door. But then I heard whispering, as if someone was talking right outside my bedroom window. I sat up, trying to listen, but there was only eerie silence. I got out of bed, pulled the curtains, and looked outside. Everything was still dark, only the dim light of the street lights illuminating the snow-covered road. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched still haunted me. I closed the door, went back to bed, and told myself that I was just imagining things. But from that night on, things started to get weirder. The clock in the house seemed to stop at exactly 3 a.m. I changed the battery, reset the time, but every time I woke up late at night, the clock hands were still pointing at 3 a.m. The space in the house became heavy. The cold air seemed to penetrate my skin. Every time I went out, I felt like the daylight was gradually disappearing. The sun would only appear for a short while, then be swallowed by darkness again. I could no longer tell the time. The sky was always gloomy, the gray clouds blocking out all the sunlight. The trees in the forest seemed never to move. Everything stood still, like a still but haunting picture. One night, as I sat writing, I heard footsteps upstairs. The house had only one floor, no attic or second floor. The footsteps were slow, one step at a time, as if someone was walking on the ceiling. I took my flashlight, walked out into the hallway and looked up. The ceiling was intact, no sign of anything unusual, but the footsteps continued, steady and scary. I decided to go outside, hoping to find an explanation. When the door opened, A cold wind rushed in, bringing with it the breath of winter. Snow covered the ground, no footprints except for the tire tracks from the previous days. I shined my flashlight around. The weak light could not dispel the darkness. It felt like I was standing in a world with no way out, where time stopped and darkness reigned forever. I went back into the house, closed the door, and locked it. But when I turned around, the lights in the house went out. Everything was plunged into absolute darkness. I heard whispers, this time clearer. Soft but ghostly voices, like hundreds of voices speaking at once. Don't go. Stay with us. I stood still, my back against the door, my hand gripping the flashlight. The small light from the flashlight shone on the walls, creating dancing shadows. Everything around me seemed to move. The shadows on the walls no longer followed the rules of light. They moved with the rhythm of my breathing. Every time I blinked, they got a little closer. A small shadow appeared in the corner of the room, standing silently looking at me. White eyes, pale face, and lips moving without making a sound. I wanted to scream, but my voice was stuck in my throat. The shadow began to move, not by walking, but as if floating above the ground. It approached inch by inch, its white eyes never leaving me. I backed away, slamming the door behind me. The black figure stopped in the middle of the room, the flashlight shining through it. But it didn't cast any shadows. It was just a dense darkness, as if the darkness had gathered into a concrete shape. The black lips parted, and from them came a cold whisper. The night will never end. You will stay here forever. I didn't know when I had fallen to the floor. The flashlight rolled across the wooden floor, its light flickering as if it was about to go out. I saw the figure bend down, its blank face only a few centimeters away from me. A cold hand touched my cheek. It felt like my flesh was being burned by ice. And then everything fell into complete darkness. I heard my heartbeat slowing down, each beat echoing in the quiet space. The darkness not only enveloped me, but also crept inside me, swallowing my consciousness and soul. The night was no longer a part of time, but a living entity, a trap with no way out. When I woke up, the clock on the wall still showed 3 a.m. Outside the window, the darkness was still thick. I was no longer sure where I was and whether I still existed in the real world. But I knew this night would never end. After that first strange night, I felt like the darkness in the house had become a living entity, always lurking and waiting. I could no longer distinguish between day and night. The sky outside was always gloomy, covered in dark clouds, and the sun was as if it had never existed in this place. The clock in the house was still stopped at 3 a.m. The second hand did not move, as if time was also stuck in an endless loop. I began to hear strange noises every night. At first it was just whispers, the sound of wind whistling through the cracks of the door. But then they became slow footsteps, heavy sighs right behind me. Every time I turned around, I saw only dense darkness, as if it were moving, forming distorted shadows on the wall. One night, as I sat in front of the fireplace, the dancing flames created strange shadows. I felt their presence. The shadows were black, their shapes blurry, but their white eyes glaring in the darkness. They hovered around me, silent, but I could feel the coldness surrounding them. Go away, I whispered, my voice trembling. But as soon as I spoke, the shadows seemed to rage. They began to move faster, their white eyes glowing in the darkness, like hundreds of terrifying fireflies. I jumped up, backing away from the door, but the living room door slammed shut. All escape routes were gone, leaving me and the approaching shadows. They no longer moved silently, but rushed towards me like black whirlwinds. I ran. My feet pounded the wooden floor, each step emitting an eerie creaking sound. The shadows followed me, their whispers turning into screams, distorted sounds that seemed to come from hell. I didn't know where I was running, only that I had to get away from them, away from those white eyes and cold hands reaching out to grab me. The hallway of the house seemed to go on forever. I ran from door to door, but every time I opened one, I found myself right back where I started. Shadows surrounded me, appearing from hidden corners, crawling up from the floor, crawling across the ceiling, everywhere. I heard a whisper in my head. Souls. We need souls. The voice wasn't one, but hundreds of voices blending together, forming a ghostly and menacing melody. I felt like I was being swallowed by the darkness, bit by bit, every breath becoming heavier. I ran to the main door, trying to open it, but it seemed locked from the outside. My hands trembled as I turned the knob, banging on the wood, but all my efforts were in vain. The shadows began to flood into the room, no longer taking human form, but turning into thick black smoke, surrounding me. A shadow reached out, its long, pointed fingers touching my shoulder. A cold feeling ran down my spine, as if the blood in my body had stopped flowing. I screamed, trying to escape, but the shadow tightened its grip on me, its hand piercing through my flesh as if it wanted to pull my soul out. I fell to the floor, my vision becoming blurry. The shadows began to wrap around me. One by one, each time they touched me, I felt a part of me being drained, as if my life force was being sucked away. The whispers turned into giggles. A child's laughter, but distorted and full of ghosts. In a moment of despair, I saw the window open. I used all my remaining strength, pushed the shadows away, and crawled towards the window. The shadow tried to pull my legs back, its cold hands gripping my ankles, but I pushed with all my might. As I climbed out of the window, I heard a piercing scream from inside the house, like the screams of hundreds of damned souls. I fell onto the cold snow outside, the icy air piercing my skin, but I felt nothing. All I knew was that I had to run away from that house, away from the shadows that wanted my soul. The night was still dark. No light appeared in the sky. When I looked back, the house stood silently in the darkness, the windows like black eyes watching me. And from inside the house, through the half-open window, I could still see the white eyes staring at me, waiting for me to return. I ran out of the house, my feet sinking into the thick snow. The cold air cut into my skin, each breath sucking in ice. The darkness still clung to me, black shadows flitting in and out of my vision, white eyes glowing like ghostly lights in the night. I had no idea where I was running. Every path in this forest seemed the same. The gnarled trees stretched out their branches like skinny arms trying to grab me. Every time I stumbled, the shadows drew closer, cold hands reaching out as if to tear my soul apart. Stay with us. Whispers rang out from all directions. It wasn't just one voice, but hundreds of voices merging together, forming a chorus of ghosts and sorrow. I looked back and saw small black shadows crawling along the ground, moving quickly, their bodies writhing unnaturally, like black snakes crawling on the white snow. I stood up again, my legs aching, but fear pushed me on. The shadows began to change, from human form to blur. Body parts seemed to melt and then gather again, forming distorted and horrifying shapes. They crawled through the trees, gliding across the ground, and sometimes I saw them climb into the air, hanging upside down from the branches, their white eyes darting around, searching for me. I didn't know how long I ran, only that the darkness seemed endless. Every time I thought I had escaped the forest, I found myself right back at the starting point. The shadows seemed to play with me, creating a maze with no way out in the dark night. Time seemed to stop. The clock in my head was always at 3 a.m. I was starting to get exhausted. My breathing became heavy. Each inhale felt like swallowing ice. Cold sweat ran down my spine, mixing with the bloody scratches on my skin. I sat down on the snow, my hands shaking as I held my head. All my senses were blurred, only a persistent whisper and white eyes peeping in the darkness. There's no escape. You'll stay here forever, I cried. Hot tears rolled down my cheeks. But as soon as they hit the ground, they froze. I felt like I was trapped in an endless loop where darkness reigned and light never appeared. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance. I wasn't sure if it was real or just an illusion, but it was the only ray of hope. I stood up, my legs wobbly, but still tried to walk forward. Each step was heavy, but the light was getting closer and closer, bit by bit. As I got closer, I realized it was a small wooden house, light pouring in from the windows. Everything looked normal, but in this dark scene, that normalcy became strange and scary. I pushed the door open, and immediately, the warm air enveloped me. The house was empty. All the furniture was neatly arranged. The fireplace in the corner was still burning, but no one was there. I sat down on the chair, unable to take my eyes off the dancing flames. The crackling of the wood created a familiar melody, but behind it, I could still hear the whisper. You can't stay here. You have to go. I looked around, but there was no one. The voice seemed to come from everywhere, soft but urgent. The door behind me slammed shut, and all the lights in the house went out. Darkness poured in again, like a hungry monster wanting to devour everything. Shadows began to appear on the walls, moving rapidly, their white eyes staring at me. They crawled across the walls, climbed up to the ceiling, and then each shadow separated, forming a circle around me. I sat on the chair, unable to move, unable to scream. All senses were paralyzed under their gaze. A larger shadow approached. Its shape was distorted, its legs were long and its hands touched the ground. It bent down, its pale face only a few centimeters from mine. Its eyes were empty, its mouth was wide open, and from it came a whisper. Your soul belongs to us. Its hand touched my chest. It felt like thousands of needles piercing my flesh. I felt my soul being pulled out, bit by bit, as if the shadow was sucking my life force. The world around me became dim. Everything gradually disappeared into endless darkness. In the last moment, I heard the wind whistling through the crack in the door, like a call from far away. And then, everything fell silent. I could no longer feel anything, only darkness and the eternal whisper. The night really never ends. When I opened my eyes, darkness still enveloped everything. No light entered, no sense of time. I no longer knew how long I had been lying there. only that this silence was more terrifying than whispers. It was like a black hole, swallowing all my thoughts and emotions. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't listen. It felt like thousands of invisible strings were holding me down to the cold ground. Every time I tried to move, the black shadows appeared, hovering around like tormented souls. Their white eyes didn't blink, just staring at me, as if they were waiting for me to give up. Why? What do you want from me? My voice was hoarse. Every word was choked with fear. But there was no answer. Only the whispers continued to ring, like hundreds of voices blending together, forming a never-ending ghostly music. I crawled back, my back touching the cold wall. When my hand touched the rough wooden surface, I realized that I was still in the small wooden house in the middle of the forest. Everything was still in the same place, but every detail was covered in a layer of dust, as if time had stopped long ago. The faint light from the flashlight on the floor was still flickering. Each time the light flashed, I saw shadows moving quickly, hiding in the dark corners. I picked up the flashlight, its light like a fragile ray of hope in this endless darkness. I decided to find a way out. I walked, each step heavy and slow. The doors in the house all led to the same room. Every time I opened the door, I found myself standing in the living room. The fire in the fireplace was still burning, but it did not bring any warmth. I tried opening the window, but it was still dark outside. There was no light, no sound, just a thick darkness, like a curtain covering the world. I pounded on the glass, but nothing happened. The sound of breaking glass was also swallowed by the eerie silence. Everything began to distort. The walls seemed to be shifting, stretching out, forming endless corridors. I ran, but every time I looked back, the black shadows still chased me. They had no specific shape, just writhing black smoke, but their white eyes were real, always looking towards me. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. Time did not exist. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself back in the same place as before, where the shadows were waiting. I began to hear whispers, not only in my head, but also in my ears, as if those voices were right next to me, breathing cold air on my skin. I sat down in the middle of the room, my hands covering my head, trying to block out the voices. But they became clearer and clearer, each word seeping into every corner of my mind. You will stay here forever. This night will never end. Darkness began to flood into the room, like a black wave swallowing everything. I could see nothing but white eyes shining in the darkness. The shadows moved closer, bit by bit, the circle around me getting tighter and tighter. I felt the cold envelop me, like 1,000 invisible hands were squeezing me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry. Every breath was painful. The largest shadow leaned down, its face without clear lines, just an empty darkness. The black lips opened, and from them came a final whisper. You belong to the night, forever. Everything became silent. I could no longer feel my body. It felt like I had melted into the darkness, become a part of it. The shadows melted away, disappeared into space, and I was left alone, floating in the endless night. The night truly never ended. I no longer remembered who I was, no longer knew time or space. Only the whispers echoed in my mind, reminding me that I belonged here, where darkness reigned and souls never found release. Story 7. Man Standing in the Rain. The small English countryside town had a peaceful charm, especially on days when it was drizzling lightly. I moved here after getting a new job at the local library. My rented house was at the end of a small alley with an old white picket fence and overgrown lavender. Everything was perfect at first. I loved spending afternoons sitting by the window, listening to the rain pattering on the roof. The smell of damp earth mixed with the aroma of hot tea made me feel like I was living in a fairy tale. But then, that peace was quickly replaced by anxiety as I began to realize that something was wrong. One evening, while sitting in an armchair reading a book, I looked out the window. It was drizzling, and the night covered the alley in a grayish hue. The yellow street lights cast long shadows on the wet pavement. And there, under the dim light, a man stood silently. He was wearing a long black raincoat, his hat covering most of his face. He didn't move, didn't have an umbrella, and didn't seem to care about the rain soaking his clothes. I tried to get a closer look, but the distance was too far for me to see clearly. My heart was pounding, but I reassured myself that he was probably just a passerby, looking for shelter from the rain. I turned back to my book, but every time I looked up, he was still there. I even felt like he was looking straight at my window, his eyes dark and lifeless. I pulled the curtains, trying to forget that scary image. But that whole night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing in the rain, motionless and silent. In the days that followed, that man still appeared. Every time it started to rain, I would see him standing in the same place, under the old street lamp. No matter if it was morning or night, he never left, nor did he ever shelter from the rain. Sometimes I would open the door to go outside, but when I looked back, he had disappeared, as if he had never existed. I started asking the neighbors about the man, but no one knew who he was. An old lady who lived nearby just shook her head, her cloudy eyes as if lost in a distant memory. "There was an accident on this road," she said, her voice whispering as if afraid someone would hear. That man, if it was him, he would have died a long time ago. I didn't dare ask more. Every night, I would pull the curtains closed, trying not to look outside. But the sound of rain still echoed in the night, and in every dream, I saw that man standing by my bed, his dark eyes staring at me, unblinking. When I woke up, the bedroom curtains were wide open, and down the street, the man in the rain was still standing there, his white eyes staring straight at my window. Ever since the man in the rain appeared, I no longer felt peaceful in this small house. The rain in the small English town seemed to never stop, each drop of rain falling on the roof, creating a dark and persistent music. I no longer dared to sit by the window. Every time it rained, I pulled the curtains tightly, but I could still feel an invisible gaze penetrating the thick fabric, looking straight at me. The first few nights, I only heard the sound of rain, but then other sounds began to appear. A gentle tapping on the window, footsteps on the stone path in front of the house, and sometimes a very close sigh, as if someone was standing right outside the door. One night, when the clock struck exactly 3 a.m., I heard a loud noise from downstairs. It sounded like someone had knocked over a wooden chair. I sat up, my heart pounding. In the dim light from the night light, I saw my shadow on the wall, but something was wrong. I wasn't alone. I slowly turned my head, my eyes trying to adjust to the darkness. The bedroom was still quiet, but I felt like the space around me had become dense. Every breath was heavy and suffocating. I pulled the flashlight from the drawer, the weak light casting a small circle on the wooden floor. My footsteps lightly touched the floor. The creaking sound echoed in the quiet space. I opened the bedroom door. The long hallway was dark like a deep hole. Everything seemed motionless, but I could hear something echoing from downstairs. The footsteps were slow, each step regular, like someone was walking in the middle of the night. When I approached the stairs, I saw that the main door was slightly open. The cold wind from outside blew in, causing the curtains to flutter gently. Rainwater formed long streaks on the floor, leading from the door into the living room. Small footprints, faint but clear, as if someone had entered my house in the dark. I swallowed, gripping the flashlight tightly. The light shone through the living room, creating long shadows on the walls. I walked forward, each step echoing in the quiet night. When the flashlight reached the corner of the room, I saw it. The man in the rain. He stood in the middle of the living room, his black raincoat dripping onto the wooden floor. His face was obscured by the darkness. Only his white eyes stood out in the darkness. His eyes had no pupils, just two empty white spaces. But I felt like he was looking straight at me, through my skin, reaching deep into my mind. Who are you?" I stuttered, my voice small and weak. There was no answer. The man just stood there, motionless, his white eyes still staring at me. Water from his raincoat dripped onto the floor, drop by drop, mixing with the rainwater stains on the floor. The sound was small but resounding, like the ticking of a clock, counting down my remaining time. I didn't know how long I stood there, only that my legs were starting to go numb, my hands gripping the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. But I didn't dare move, didn't dare take my eyes off him. It felt like if I blinked, he would rush towards me, his white eyes taking over my entire field of vision. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and went out. Everything was plunged into absolute darkness. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, but the patter of rain outside and the soft breathing right next to my ear. When the flashlight came back on, the man was gone. The main door was still open, and a cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the steam and smell of damp earth. I rushed over, slammed the door shut, and locked it tightly. But in that moment, I saw through the small window on the door. Under the dim streetlight, the man standing there again in the endless rain. He tilted his head, his white eyes following me. His lips moved, making no sound, but I could hear the words echoing in my head. "You will never escape me." I can't remember how many nights I've stayed awake since the man in the rain appeared. My short naps were always interrupted by gentle knocks on the door, slow footsteps on the stone path in front of the house, and indistinct whispers. All my senses were tricked, not knowing what was reality and what was an illusion. One gloomy morning, I decided to leave the house. I needed to escape the stuffy atmosphere and the darkness that always followed me. The small town was hidden under a thick layer of fog. The old houses with dark red tiled roofs appeared like silent figures in the rain. I walked on the stone path, my feet cold every time I stepped on the puddles. But no matter where I went, I always felt like I was not alone. Whenever I looked back, I always saw the silhouette of the man in the rain, standing in the far corner, motionless and staring at me. Those white eyes were always there, whether I closed them or turned away. They appeared not only in the dark, but also in the daytime, among the people passing by. But it seemed that only I could see them. I began asking around the townspeople. They all talked about a man who had lived here, a stranger from somewhere no one knew. He always stood in the rain, looking at the houses, but never spoke to anyone. Until one day, he disappeared, leaving no trace. But soon after, strange stories began to appear. People heard knocking on the door at night, saw dark shadows passing by the windows, and always felt like they were being watched when it rained. "I think he's still here," an old woman told me, her cloudy eyes staring into space. "He can't leave. The rain is where he belongs." The words sent a chill down my spine. If he was really dead, what was haunting me? I couldn't bear it anymore. I decided to confront him, or at least prove to myself that it was all an illusion. That night, when the sound of rain began to sound, I stood in front of the window, pulled the curtains, and looked straight into the night. As I expected, the man was still standing there, under the dim street lights. Rainwater ran down his black raincoat, dripping onto the cold ground. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped outside. The cold wind blew, carrying the musty smell of earth and trees. Every step I took made a crunching sound on the wet gravel. The man didn't move, just stood there, his white eyes staring at me. As I got closer, I realized that not a single drop of rain had touched him. Around him the air was dry and quiet, as if he was standing in another world, separate from reality. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice faint in the rain. "What do you want from me?" He didn't answer. His black lips moved, but no sound came out. But in my head, whispers began to sound, clear and sharp. "Stay. Forever." Suddenly, he moved. Not by walking, but as if floating above the ground. The distance between us closed in an instant. And before I knew it, he was standing right in front of me. His white eyes grew larger, taking up my entire field of vision. I stepped back, but my feet felt like they were pinned to the ground. His cold hand touched my shoulder, and it felt like my flesh was being burned by ice. His breath fanned my face, the smell of mold and decay filling my nose, choking me. "You will never leave here." The voice echoed in my head, each word like a sharp knife cutting into my mind. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, his long, sharp nails digging into my flesh. Before my eyes, everything began to blur. The small English town disappeared, leaving only a thick curtain of rain and endless darkness. I heard giggling coming from all directions, like hundreds of voices blending together, forming a ghostly and endless song. I woke up on the cold ground, the cold seeping into my skin, making me shiver. All around me, the rain was still falling steadily, each drop of cold water falling on my face. I tried to sit up, but my legs felt frozen, stiff and numb. The man in the rain was still standing there, just a few steps away from me. He didn't move, but I felt like that shadow was creeping into every cell of my body. His white eyes didn't blink, just staring at me, as if wanting to swallow my soul. "Where am I?" I stuttered, my voice weak and lost in the rain. "You've been here, forever." That voice rang in my head, not in words, but in cold and distant whispers. Each word was like a sharp knife, cutting into my mind, causing me so much pain that I wanted to scream. I tried to stand up, my legs shaking to support my body. But as soon as I stood firm, the man began to move, not by walking, but as if floating above the ground, his feet not touching the ground, the raindrops running down his black raincoat, creating long, cold streaks. I backed away, step by step, but it seemed that every time I took a step back, he moved a little closer. The distance between us narrowed. His white eyes grew larger and larger, taking up all of my vision. Don't come any closer," I whispered, my hand gripping the flashlight that had long since gone out. But he didn't stop. His hand reached out, his long, sharp fingers touching my shoulder. It felt like thousands of needles piercing my skin, cold and numb. I fell to the wet ground. The rain soaked into my clothes, seeping through every layer of my skin, bringing a cold feeling from within. The man leaned down, his face only a few centimeters away from mine. His breath blew on my face. The smell of mold and decay rushed into my nose, making me suffocate. "You can never leave here." The whisper rang out, each word seeping into my mind, creating terrifying images of darkness and endless rain. I felt my soul being pulled out of my body. An invisible suction force that I couldn't resist, little by little. I felt myself sinking into darkness. The world around me became blurry. All sounds were swallowed by the pattering of rain. But suddenly I heard the church bell ringing in the distance. That sound was like a ray of light in the night, pulling me out of the control of the man in the rain. I used all my remaining strength to push him away and ran as fast as I could. I didn't know how far I ran, but my feet kept moving. Every time I looked back, I could still see that black shadow chasing me, its white eyes sparkling in the rain. But the church bells were getting closer and closer, and the faint light from the street lamp also appeared before my eyes. As I rushed into the old church gate, I heard a piercing scream from behind me. I turned around. The man in the rain was standing outside the church fence. His white eyes turned bloodshot. His mouth opened wide, a painful scream coming from his throat. The light from the church seemed to dispel the darkness. The black shadows around him began to disappear, little by little, until only a hazy smoke remained mixed with the rain. I sat down on the cold ground, my breathing ragged and my body exhausted. But even when the man in the rain had disappeared, I still heard a whisper in my head. "You will never escape me." That voice still echoed, soft but powerful, like a curse that forever haunted me in the endless rain. Story 8. Woman in the Hotel Hallway. When I arrived in London, it was already dark. A light rain had been falling all the way from the airport to the hotel, making me feel heavy. The Crimson Hotel, located in the heart of the city, stood out for its ancient architecture and the dim yellow lights shining from its Gothic windows. I had come here for work, planning to stay for a few days before returning home. The hotel lobby was large but quiet. The receptionist's high heels clicked steadily on the marble floor, echoing in the quiet space. When I received the room key, she bowed slightly, a faint smile on her lips. Room 306, at the end of the third floor corridor. The elevator is on the left. Her voice was soft but had a strange tone, as if she had said this sentence too many times. I dragged my suitcase as instructed. The old elevator slowly opened with a creaking sound. Inside, the opaque mirrors reflected my shadow, distorted and blurred. The elevator doors closed, and as it began to move, I felt a chill run down my spine. The third floor opened into a long hallway, The ceiling lights were yellow and old paintings hung along the walls. The air here seemed thick, my footsteps creaking against the worn red carpet. Room 306 was at the end of the hallway, a dark wooden door with a faded brass room number. As I inserted the key into the lock, I heard a faint noise from the end of the hallway. High heels clicked lightly on the floor, each step slow and measured. I turned around but saw no one. The hallway was empty, save for the flickering lights that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice echoing in the silence. There was no answer. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and quickly locked it. The room was small but cozy, with a white bed and large windows overlooking the streets of London. But even though I was in the room, the feeling of being watched did not go away. I pulled the curtains, checking the lock one more time before sitting down on the bed. I turned on the TV to create some noise, but the flickering images on the screen only added to the uneasiness. I decided to take a shower, hoping the hot water would help me relax after a long day. In the bathroom, the sound of running water mixed with the sound of rain outside to form a monotonous song. As I wiped the mirror behind the steam, I caught a glimpse of a figure passing by. I turned around, startled, but no one was there. The bathroom door was still locked, everything in place. I must be too tired, I told myself, but my heart was still uneasy. I climbed into bed, pulled the covers over me, and closed my eyes. But the noise came again, this time more clearly. Light footsteps in the hallway, a giggle that sounded like a woman's, but the sound was distorted and twisted. I sat up, listening more closely. The footsteps stopped right in front of my door, and then 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I held my breath, not daring to move. My hands gripped the blanket, my eyes wide, as I stared at the dark wooden door. The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Who's out there?" I asked, my voice so soft I wasn't sure if I'd actually made a sound. There was no answer. Everything fell silent again, save for the rain outside and the erratic beating of my heart. I decided not to open the door, trying to ignore it, and convince myself that it was just someone in the hotel playing a prank. But as soon as I lay down, I heard a whisper. The sound did not come from outside the door, but from inside the room, right next to my ear. The whisper was soft but cold, like a cold wind brushing against my skin. "Don't go." I didn't dare turn around. My whole body was stiff. Cold sweat poured out. Each breath became heavy and intermittent. I felt like someone was lying next to me, just a few centimeters away, breathing coldly on my neck. When I gathered up the courage to open my eyes, I saw a blurry figure in the mirror opposite the bed. A woman, long hair hanging down, a pale face and deep black eyes. She stood still, her lips moving, but I couldn't hear her voice. Only her eyes stared straight at me, unblinking, unmoving. And then everything fell into darkness. When I woke up, it was morning. The weak sunlight filtered through the curtains, but brought no warmth. My body felt heavy. Every movement was tiring, as if I had run a long distance during the night. The memory of the woman in the mirror last night was as faint as a nightmare, but the cold feeling and the empty gaze still lingered in my mind. I stepped into the bathroom. The cold water washed away some of the fatigue, but when I looked up at the mirror, I saw a faint streak on the glass. At first, I thought it was steam, but when I wiped it away, the scribbled words gradually became clear. Don't leave. I stepped back, my heart pounding. My hand trembled as I held the towel. All my senses were on edge, as if someone was standing right behind me, their cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned around, but the bathroom was still empty. Only the drops of water falling from the showerhead made a monotonous but haunting sound. I left the hotel that afternoon, trying to escape the gloomy atmosphere that followed me. London was crowded and noisy, but among the people passing by, I always felt like someone was watching me. Every time I looked through the windows of the shops, I saw a blurry figure standing in the distance. His eyes were dark and unblinking. I returned to the hotel when it was dark. The light rain that had lasted all day made the London streets reflect the yellow lights. I walked into the lobby, feeling like I was returning to a trap with no way out. The receptionist from yesterday was no longer there, replaced by a middle-aged man with a bland smile and empty eyes. Third floor, room 306. He spoke before I could even open my mouth. His voice was flat, without any emotion. I nodded, asked no more questions, and quickly entered the elevator. The third floor hallway was as quiet as last night. The pale yellow light shone through the old paintings on the wall, creating distorted shadows. As I approached room 306, I heard a soft sound coming from the end of the hallway. Footsteps were slow and steady, and a voice as soft as the wind blew past my ears. Don't go. Stay with me. I froze in place. The voice was not unfamiliar. It was exactly the same whisper I heard last night. I turned my head. The hallway was still empty, but the lights on the ceiling began to flicker, creating dancing shadows on the walls. The door to room 306 opened before I could insert the key. Inside, the room was dark, only the light from the hallway casting a faint glow on the floor. I stepped in, the door slowly closing behind me, emitting a long creaking sound. I turned on the light, but nothing happened. The room was shrouded in darkness, turning every corner into a haven for invisible shadows. I felt the presence of someone, some entity lurking in the darkness, staring at me. Are you here? I asked, my voice echoing in the silence. But the only response I got was the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the window and the steady sound of rain falling outside. Suddenly, the room's lights turned on. The sudden brightness made me blink repeatedly. When my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw her standing in the corner of the room, where the darkness was still thick. The woman in the mirror. Her long, disheveled hair partially covered her face, her skin pale and her lips purple. She didn't move, but those deep black eyes were still staring at me, as if trying to suck out all the life from me. I stepped back, my back touching the door. My hand groped for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The room became stifling, the air heavy, as if it wanted to crush me. The woman started to move, but not walk, but float above the ground. Every time she got closer, the temperature in the room dropped, my breath forming a hazy white mist. He killed me, she said, her voice ringing like the wind passing by my ears. I can't leave. Don't leave me. I couldn't say anything. My throat felt choked. She moved closer, those dark eyes staring deeply into me, making me unable to look away. Her cold hand touched my shoulder. It felt like thousands of needles piercing my skin. And then she disappeared. Everything returned to normal. The room lights were still on. The windows were open to let the cold wind in, but on the mirror, the words in blood still appeared, scrawled and scary. "Don't go. Stay with me." I collapsed to the floor, my eyes staring at those words, the whispering in my head still ringing endlessly. I knew that even if I left, she would stay forever. And perhaps a part of me would never escape this room, number 306. After that terrifying night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the woman with deep black eyes appeared. Her gaze seemed to pull me into another world, where darkness reigned and whispers never ceased. I sat, hugging my knees on the bed. The room light was on, but it didn't bring any sense of security. I started to learn about the Crimson Hotel. The travel websites only talked about the ancient beauty and long history of this place. But there was no information about the strange phenomena I was experiencing. I called the front desk, asked about the woman in the mirror, but the staff was silent for a long time before replying in a mechanical voice. "We don't know about that." The feeling of being isolated in my own place made me even more uneasy. Everyone in the hotel was like a shadow, passing me by without leaving a trace. Every time I asked, they just smiled and gave vague answers. Their eyes were empty like soulless dolls. One rainy afternoon, I decided to go down to the reception desk to find more information. The reception desk was deserted. The guest bell on the table was rusty, but when I rang the bell, no one appeared. The surrounding space was eerily quiet. Only the ticking sound of the old clock hanging on the wall rang regularly. I tiptoed into the file room behind the reception desk. The old wooden cabinets were filled with papers. Each cabinet was labeled by year. I rummaged through the old documents. My eyes stopped at a file that had turned the color of time. The cover of the file clearly stated, "Room 306 case." I opened the file. The old pages rustled in my hands. A black and white image appeared. A photo of the crime scene with bloodstains on the floor. The headline was short but chilling. "Woman murdered in room 306. The investigation report stated that the victim was Emily Harper, 25, who had been murdered by her boyfriend in a violent relationship. She had been strangled on the bed in room 306, and the man had disappeared without a trace after committing the crime. The police never found him, and the case was quickly classified as unsolved." A chill ran down my spine. Her name, the pale face in the photo, the wide-open eyes staring straight into the lens. It was the woman I had seen. Those deep black eyes were not just an illusion, but an unquenchable hatred. Suddenly, the space around me became stifling. The door to the file room slammed shut. The ceiling light began to flicker. The whispers rang out again, this time clearer, as if someone was standing right next to my ear. "Don't go. Stay with me." I pulled back, my hands gripping the file. The room became dark, only flickering light and dark patches, like in a distorted dream. From within the darkness, Emily's figure appeared, her eyes deep black and her face pale. She didn't move, but the space around her seemed to distort, pulling me closer to her, bit by bit. "He killed me." Voices echoed from everywhere, but her lips didn't move. She moved closer, her feet hovering above the ground, water droplets dripping from her wet hair, forming puddles on the floor. I turned around trying to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Her cold hand touched my shoulder, feeling like thousands of needles piercing my flesh. Every time she touched me, I felt the pain, despair, and resentment spreading from her to me. "Don't leave me." I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She leaned close to my face, her deep black eyes taking over my vision. The world around her slowly faded away, leaving only darkness and a persistent whisper. Suddenly, the door swung open. Light from the hallway flooded in, dispelling the darkness, and Emily's figure disappeared. I collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily, still clutching the file. But the words on it had disappeared, leaving only blank, meaningless pages. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. But as soon as I stood up, the whisper rang out again, this time right next to my ear. "He's still here, and you'll stay with me forever." After escaping the file room, I no longer remember how I ran back to my room. My mind was spinning with blurry images, Emily's whispers, and a feeling of endless cold. All my senses were tense, as if at any moment her deep black eyes would appear in my vision again. I sat on the bed, the only night light in the room, flickering continuously. Room number 306 became stuffy. The walls seemed to be closing in, squeezing me. I tried to reassure myself that it was all an illusion, but the whispers did not stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Emily's voice, soft but full of resentment. "He's still here, and you will stay with me forever." I couldn't stay here any longer. I decided to leave the hotel that night, but when I opened the door, the hallway was long and dark, like an endless pit. The yellow lights on the ceiling flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Every time I walked, my footsteps echoed, but something was wrong. I heard other footsteps, slow and in sync with mine, as if someone was walking right behind me. I turned around. The hallway was empty. But when I looked into the mirror hanging on the wall, I saw another figure standing behind me. A man, his face pale, his eyes empty, and a long purple bruise on his neck like the mark of a tightrope. "He's still here," Emily's voice echoed again. The shadow in the mirror didn't move, but those eyes stared at me, not moving away. I recognized the man in the mirror as Emily's boyfriend, the one who had killed her in room 306. But if he had escaped, why did I see him here? Why was he appearing in the darkness of this hotel? Everything began to make sense when I heard the story from an elderly housekeeping staff. She said that after Emily was murdered, her boyfriend was never found. But there were rumors that night, people heard screaming in room 306, and when the police broke in, they only found Emily's body. There was no trace of the killer, but there were bloodstains in the room that stretched to the window. Some people believe that Emily did not move on. Her spirit remained in the hotel, and it was she who dragged her boyfriend into the darkness. Those who stayed in room 306 heard her whispering, and sometimes they saw the shadow of the man in the mirror, his face distorted and his eyes empty. I felt like I was stuck in a loop with no way out. Every time I tried to leave, the hotel door locked, the hallway stretched on forever, and darkness enveloped me. The whispers grew louder, no longer Emily's soft voice, but hundreds of different voices, all blending together into a ghostly cacophony. I ran down the hall, trying to find a way out, but when I reached the front desk, there was no one there. The clocks on the walls were all stopped at 3 a.m., the second hand motionless. I felt like I was in another world where time stood still and darkness ruled. The man in the mirror appeared in the corner of the room, gliding across the walls like a shadow. He said nothing, just looked at me with lifeless eyes, and the bruise on his neck was still lingering. I heard Emily giggle, the laughter no longer that of a young girl but distorted into a hoarse, distorted, resentful sound. He never left, neither did you. Darkness began to surround me, the shadows on the wall gradually forming distorted shapes, faces without eyes, long hands reaching out from nothingness. I collapsed to the floor, my eyes staring at the ceiling, where the shadows swayed like puppets without strings. In that moment, I felt Emily's cold hand touch me. It felt like thousands of needles piercing my flesh, as if she was pulling my soul out of my body. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, only my eyes were wide open, looking into her deep black eyes. And then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I found myself standing in the mirror, my eyes empty and my face pale. I saw Emily standing beside me, her smile distorted and her lips moving soundlessly. Outside the mirror, the hotel corridor was still endless, and from afar, I saw another person walking towards me, followed by shadows and never-ending whispers. Story 9. Person standing behind in the photo. San Jose, my high school, is located in the suburbs, surrounded by ancient oak trees and leafy paths. Every morning, sunlight filters through the foliage, creating a peaceful scene. But ever since I moved here, a strange feeling has always clung to me. The old walls, long, quiet hallways, and flashing neon lights made me feel uncomfortable. On the first day of class, I couldn't help but notice the photos hanging in the main hallway. They were all yearbook photos from many generations ago, smiling young faces in classic uniforms. But when I looked closer, there was one photo that sent a chill down my spine. It was a photo of a class from the 1970s, everyone standing neatly in 2 rows. But behind them, right in the dark corner of the photo, was the shadowy figure of a woman. I stepped closer, squinting. The woman in the photo stood some distance away from everyone, with no clear face, just a blurry figure with long flowing hair. I felt like her invisible eyes were looking straight at me, through the glass and time. "What are you looking at?" The voice suddenly rang out, startling me. It was Laura, a new classmate. She stood next to me, her eyes curious. I saw a shadow in the photo," I stuttered, pointing to a dark corner. Laura looked at her, but then burst out laughing. "What are you talking about? There's no one there. It's just a class photo." I frowned, looking at the photo again. The figure was still there, as clear as before. But I didn't say anything more, just smiled awkwardly and followed Laura into the classroom. During the whole class that day, I couldn't concentrate. Every time I thought about the photo, the image of that woman appeared in my mind. I wondered if I was imagining things, but the strange feeling did not go away. The next day, I decided to go back to the hallway to look at the photo again. But this time, I saw something even stranger. The silhouette of the woman in the photo seemed to have moved closer. She was no longer standing in the far corner, but had moved into the line of people in front. Her long hair still fell down to cover her face, but I could make out her deep black eyes, staring into the lens. My heart pounded. Cold sweat ran down my spine. I turned around, looking around the hallway. There was no one there. There was only the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, the creaking of the old wooden floor, and the flashing neon lights. I took out my phone, took a photo to compare. But when I looked at the screen, the silhouette of the woman did not appear in the photo. At this point, I began to realize that something was wrong. I researched the school's history, but there was no mention of the woman in the photo. I asked around with former teachers and students, but they all said it was just an ordinary yearbook photo. No one remembered a woman who had ever appeared in that photo. I spent many evenings searching the old corners of the school, looking for clues about the woman. One day, I heard the older teachers telling stories. Not to say it clearly, but just like a distant whisper. She was a student of the school, passed away many years ago, unexpectedly pregnant, scared and desperate. She sneaked into the old bathroom to relieve herself, unexpectedly gone forever. This information made me shiver. A student who had studied at this school, a forgotten story, and resentment that could not be appeased. From that day on, I knew that I could no longer ignore her presence. The feeling of being watched became more and more obvious. Every time I walked through that hallway, I always had the feeling that someone was standing behind me. I didn't dare to turn around, but that shadowy figure was always there, gliding past the corner of my eyes. One night, while I was doing my homework in the school library, I heard whispering coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing through the window. But when I stepped outside, the hallway was empty. I decided to go to the photo again, this time carrying a small flashlight. The flashlight's light swept across the photo, shining straight into the dark corner. And there, the woman's figure stood right in the middle of the row among the smiling faces. Her long hair covered her face, but I could feel a pain, a deep resentment radiating from her. "What do you want?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. But a cold wind blew by, causing the flashlight to flicker. And in that moment, I heard a soft but painful voice. "He killed me." My hand trembled. The flashlight fell to the floor, the light rolling up to the ceiling. When I bent down to pick up the flashlight, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I screamed, turned around, but there was no one. I looked back at the photo and the woman's figure had disappeared. I couldn't explain what was happening, but from that moment, I knew that the woman in the photo was more than just a shadow. She was here, in this school, carrying a grudge that could not be let go. And I, somehow, became the only one who saw her. The following nights, I couldn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the woman in the photo appeared, along with her empty black eyes and crooked smile. The feeling of being watched became more and more obvious, as if every step I took in this school was being followed by some invisible eyes. I tried to find out more about her story, but all the documents seemed to have been erased. The old records were gone, and the teachers always seemed to avoid me when I asked about the students who had attended this school. I began to suspect that this school was hiding a bigger secret than I thought. One day, while I was in the deserted hallway of the school, I felt a cold air flow through. Everything seemed to become silent. Only the sound of my footsteps echoed. But then, I heard a whispering voice from somewhere. She never left. I turned around, but saw no one. I kept walking, but the whisper still haunted me. like a song that repeated over and over again. She never left. I didn't understand why I heard these whispers. No one was talking. No one was standing around. It was just me and the echo in my head. My dreams became clearer. I saw her, her deep black eyes constantly looking at me. I felt the resentment in those eyes. A cold feeling enveloped me. One night, while I was doing homework in the library, I heard a slight noise from the end of the room. The footsteps were slow, one step at a time, as if someone was walking in the quiet space. I turned off the desk lamp, held my breath, and waited. Darkness filled the room. Only the faint light from the neon lights outside shone in. The footsteps came closer, and I realized I was not alone. From the back of the room, a blurry figure emerged. At first, I thought it was just the shadow of some late student. But then I saw that it wasn't walking, but floating on the ground. The figure gradually became clearer. A woman with long, flowing hair, a pale face, and deep black eyes. She didn't say anything, just standing there looking at me. But from behind her, I saw the silhouette of a man. He stood motionless, his eyes vacant, and on his neck was a long purple bruise, like the mark of a rope. He didn't move, but his presence made the space feel stuffy and heavy. "He's still alive." Her voice rang out, soft but full of resentment. "He abandoned me, and I held him back." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman in the photo wasn't just an invisible ghost. She had the power, and she pulled her boyfriend into her world, where he could never escape. I turned around, but the hallway was empty. However, the whisper did not disappear. It still echoed, soft but powerful, like a curse. Every step I took away from the photo, I felt like the figure was getting closer. When I returned to the classroom, I tried to concentrate on my homework. But in my mind, there was only the whisper and the image of the woman in the photo. I realized that her story did not stop at her tragic death. There was some secret related to her missing boyfriend. And perhaps she was the one who made him disappear. My dreams were getting worse every night. She wasn't just standing silently in the corner anymore, but now I saw her moving. In my nightmares, she came closer to me, her eyes deep black, her face pale. She whispered words I couldn't make out, but her voice always made me wake up with a start, sweating and feeling heavy. I realized that the things I saw weren't just temporary hallucinations. Every time I walked through the hallway with the yearbook photo, I felt her presence more clearly. She was no longer confined to the photo. She had stepped outside. I saw her silhouette in the corner of my eye, heard her soft footsteps behind me, and sometimes her soft, almost imperceptible breathing. I decided I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. I had to find out about my boyfriend. If she had really pulled him into her world, I needed to know why. But everything I searched for led to dead ends. No one in the school remembered him. No one had ever heard of the incident. It was as if he had never existed. One day, while I was in the library, I happened to find an old notebook hidden in the corner of a shelf. The cover was covered in dust, but as I flipped through the pages, I saw old notes about students and teachers from years ago. Among them, there was a name I had never heard of: David Marsh. The words next to the name read, "Disappeared after the bathroom incident. Whereabouts unknown. David Marsh." The name repeated itself in my head all night. I didn't know who he was, but I had a feeling that this was the boyfriend she had mentioned. I dreamed of him more clearly this time. He stood in a dark room, his eyes empty and a long bruise on his neck. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. She held me back. I heard his voice in my dreams, hoarse and desperate. I couldn't get away. I woke up, cold sweat running down my spine. I couldn't ignore these dreams anymore. I decided to find out more about David Marsh, but this time I wasn't going to look in school. I started searching online, digging through old newspaper articles, and finally I found a short news story from years ago. David Marsh, high school student, missing in action. Police have found no trace. Case is classified as unsolved. The photo accompanying the story was of a young man, a faint smile and a sad gaze. I couldn't help but recognize that the expression on his face was similar to the figure in my dreams. This was the man she had pulled into her world. One night, I heard a giggle coming from the hallway. Not a happy laugh, but a distorted, cold laugh, like the laugh of someone who has lost everything. I walked out of the room. The darkness in the hallway was thicker than usual. The laughter led me to the yearbook photo. But this time, she was not the only one standing in the photo. David was there too, his face blurred as if it had melted into the darkness. I heard her voice ring out. I held him back. And now, you can't escape either. The image in the photo changed right before my eyes. She stepped forward, her long hair partially covering her face, and David stood right behind her, his lifeless eyes fixed on me. I couldn't take my eyes off the photo. It felt like there was an invisible force holding me back. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. In that moment, I realized that she didn't just want revenge for herself. She wanted to pull others into her circle, so they would never escape the world she had created. As I left the hallway, the giggles echoed in my head. I knew I couldn't escape her. Every night, the dreams returned, clearer each time, and I saw her and David standing there, watching me, waiting for me to enter their world. I didn't know how to escape, and I wasn't sure I wanted to escape, because every time I saw them, I felt the pain, the resentment, and the loneliness wash over me. And I knew I had become a part of their story, a story that had no end. After my last encounter with David's shadow in the hallway, I knew I could no longer ignore the signs around me. The whispers, the shadows, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I had to find out the truth, not only to free myself, but to help her. I returned to the library one evening, after everyone had gone home. The building was quiet, save for the soft hum of the fan and the flickering of the fluorescent lights. I went to the old filing cabinet, where I had stored articles and documents I had never touched before. A chill ran through me, but I told myself I couldn't let fear hold me back. Finally, I found an article from a local newspaper that had stopped publishing. It wasn't just about her death. It also mentioned someone else, David Marsh. The article said that on the night of her death, a witness saw David running out of the school in a panic. However, he disappeared shortly after. The police could find no trace, and the story was quickly forgotten. I read the passage over and over again, trying to piece together the puzzle. Was David the cause of her death? Or was he just another victim in the cycle of resentment? The more I read, the more I realized that her death was not simply an accident or a rash decision. Some force had held him back, just like it held her. And now they existed together in the hazy world between life and death. I heard footsteps from the hallway outside. At first it was just a soft step, but then it became clearer, slow and steady. I closed the file, feeling a cold air rush into the room. The lights in the library flickered, creating strange shadows on the walls. I turned around, but there was no one. I know what you're looking for. The voice came from behind. I spun around, and this time, there she was, no longer a shadowy figure in the mirror or the photograph. She stood right in the middle of the library, her long hair hanging limply, her face pale and her eyes deep black. But what made me shiver was the twisted smile on her lips. "He abandoned me," she said, her voice soft but filled with resentment. I kept him. I kept him forever. I couldn't take my eyes off her. The resentment in her eyes seemed to swallow me. I felt the coldness envelop me, as if the air in the library had been sucked out. I wanted to ask, to understand, but my throat tightened, unable to form words. She moved closer, and each step she took made the space feel more stuffy. "He doesn't deserve to live. He left me when I needed him most. And you know what? You're going to help me finish what I left unfinished." I don't know if I nodded or not, but as soon as she smiled, I felt a jolt of electricity run through my body. In that moment, I saw a flash of an image. David standing in a dark room, his eyes filled with panic, but he wasn't human anymore. He was just a shadow, a twisted entity trapped in her world. She disappeared soon after, leaving me standing in the library, shaking and confused. But I knew she wasn't really gone. She was waiting, and I couldn't escape the story I'd stumbled into. I didn't dare turn back to the hallway with the yearbook photo, but I knew that every time I passed by, I would feel her eyes on me. And now, I felt David's eyes too. They weren't just shadows from the past. They are part of the present, part of me. Story 10. Sounds Behind the Wall. I moved into this small apartment during the winter, when Houston was unusually cold. The new house was on the 3rd floor of an old apartment building. The brick walls were discolored. The hallways were lit with yellow lights. I thought this place would be quiet, a private place for me to concentrate on writing. I liked the feeling of the apartment when I first moved in. The walls were old but clean. The space was small but cozy. Every evening I sat at my desk near the window, looking out at the flickering street lights. But after only a few days, I began to notice something strange. At first, it was just small noises. A light, steady tapping sound came from the wall to the right of the living room. I thought it was my neighbor doing some repairs, so I didn't pay much attention. But the tapping came regularly, at no particular time. At midnight, early in the morning, sometimes even in the middle of the afternoon, I heard it. One night, I decided to investigate where the noise was coming from. I stood close to the wall, listening closely. The knocking seemed very close, as if someone was standing right on the other side of the wall, lightly touching the surface. But the strange thing was that I knew that the other side of the wall was not another apartment. It was just the wall that separated my room from a small space, a space I had never been in before. I summoned up the courage to knock again. My knock echoed, but was immediately answered by 3 small, steady knocks. My heart pounded, and cold sweat ran down my spine. Who was on the other side, and how could they respond so quickly? I asked the building manager about the wall. He just shrugged, saying that it was an old part of the wall from before the building was renovated. Nobody lives there, he said. It's just a gap, a space that's been empty for a long time. But his explanation didn't reassure me. The tapping continued every night, growing louder. Sometimes I heard other noises too, sighs, whispers, so soft I couldn't make them out. I began to wonder if I was imagining things. One evening, sitting at my desk, I stared at that wall. A bold idea struck me. Open the wall. If no one lived there, what was in that space? Why was the noise coming from there? I took a small hammer and began tapping the wall, trying to find a weak spot. The tapping started immediately, 3 taps, as if in response to my action. But this time, I heard something else, like something rolling across the floor. I froze in place, my hammer shaking. "What do you want?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. But then, from behind the wall, I heard a soft but sorrowful voice. "Don't leave me." I couldn't mistake it. It was a woman's voice, weak and resentful. It echoed in my head, causing me to drop the hammer and step back. Cold sweat ran down my forehead. I tried to calm myself, but the question still appeared in my mind. Who is behind this wall? I could never forget that voice that night. Even though it was just a short whisper, the sound haunted me for a whole week. I didn't dare go near the wall again. Every time I passed the living room, I walked faster, my eyes fixed straight ahead. But no matter how hard I tried, I could still hear faint noises coming from behind the wall. I tried to comfort myself that it was just the wind, or perhaps insects in the structure of the building. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The noises were too regular, too like someone was trying to communicate. One night, I even heard a sigh, so long that I jumped out of bed, my palms cold. It all came to a head one evening as I sat on the sofa, trying to watch a movie to distract myself from my fear. The tapping started as usual, soft, steady, but this time, it didn't stop. It grew louder, stronger. I could feel the vibrations in the air, as if someone were pounding on the wall with a fist. I stood up, slowly approaching the wall. The lights in the living room began to flicker, and the air felt colder than usual. I touched the wall with my fingertips, feeling the cold seep through the paint. The tapping stopped abruptly and was replaced by a strange sound, a hissing sound, like wind whistling through a very small gap. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice echoing in the silent room. But there was no answer. I stepped back, a chill spreading from the soles of my feet to the top of my head. And then, I heard a whisper. "Help me. Don't leave me." My legs nearly buckled. The voice was soft but full of resentment, like a plea from far away. I didn't know what to do. Cold sweat ran down my forehead, my heart pounding. I didn't dare to answer, didn't dare to move closer. But I couldn't take my eyes off the wall, as if it had drawn my gaze. The living room lights suddenly went out. I rushed to the switch, turned it on, but nothing happened. The room was plunged into darkness, only the faint light from outside coming in through the window. I stood still, listening. There were no more whispers, no more knocking. But the silence was even more terrifying than the strange sounds. I don't know how long I stood there, only that when the lights came back on, I saw a long scratch on the wall. The scratch wasn't clear, but it was shaped like scribbles. I couldn't read it, but it felt like someone had tried to leave a message. My hand trembled as I touched the scratch. It felt as cold as ice. I stepped back, plopping down on the sofa, my mind blank. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me. But I didn't know who they were, or what they wanted. There was only one thing I was sure of. This wall was more than just a wall. And if I wanted to find out the truth, I would have to face my fears. The nights after I heard the whispers, my apartment no longer felt peaceful. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice coming from the wall. The sighs and soft words seemed to seep into every corner of the room. Adding to the stuffiness and anxiety, I began to pay more attention to the wall. During the day, it was just an old cracked brick covered in faded paint. But when night fell, I felt something lurking behind the wall. Not a specific sound, but a presence. Something invisible, but still making me shiver. One night, I mustered up the courage to turn on the lights in the entire room and approach the wall. I touched the brick surface, feeling the coldness that went to my bones. I wondered, what could be making those whispers? Was it the wind coming through the cracks in the wall? Or was there really someone on the other side? I rummaged through the drawer for a small hammer that I used for fixing things. My heart pounded as I held the hammer in my hand. I placed the head of the hammer against the wall, tapping it slowly, one tap at a time. The taps echoed in the quiet room, but there was no response. I waited, but there was only silence. "Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice echoing in the silence. Still nothing. But just as I put the hammer down and turned to leave, I heard it. A soft but steady tap in response. 3 taps, steady and clear. I stood frozen, my hand gripping the hammer's handle. Someone or something was on the other side, and they had just answered me. I didn't know how long I stood there, only that each passing second made me feel colder and more uneasy. The lights in the room began to flicker, and the air became oppressive. I felt like there were thousands of invisible eyes watching me from all sides. I decided to knock again, harder this time. Immediately, the knocking came from the other side, as if to confirm that I was not imagining things. I leaned my head close to the wall, trying to listen. There was a whisper, very small but clear. "Help me. Don't leave me." My heart was pounding. The voice was not just a sound, but a plea. It carried pain, resentment. I took my hand off the wall, stepped back, gripping the hammer so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I didn't know what to do. Over the next week, the noises became more and more obvious. During the day, the apartment was quiet, but at night, the walls seemed to come alive. There were knocks, whispers, and sometimes I even heard a light, scratching sound. Every night, I tried to ignore them, but the presence grew stronger. I began to feel that I was no longer safe in this apartment. But at the same time, I couldn't leave without knowing what was happening. I felt that if I left this wall, I would never have answers. Something behind this wall needed me, and I couldn't turn away. One night, I decided to take action. I turned on the lights in the room, took a hammer in my hand, and stood in front of the wall. I couldn't bear to just tap lightly anymore. I wanted to know the truth. I raised the hammer and started hitting the wall. The sound of the hammer echoed in the small apartment, each hit making me feel like I was breaking a membrane between two worlds. After a few hits, a section of the wall cracked. I pulled hard with my hands, and pieces of paint and broken tiles fell to the floor. As the hole became clearer, I shined my flashlight inside. The dim light illuminated a small gap behind the wall, but what I saw froze me in place. In the darkness, I saw a hand. It was wrinkled and pale, as if it had been there for a long time. The light from the flashlight shone in, revealing the shape of a twisted arm, as if reaching out to search for something. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt as if the wall was breathing, living. I backed away, the hammer falling to the floor, the metallic sound echoing in the quiet room. But I couldn't take my eyes off the hole. The longer the flashlight shone, the clearer I could see the shape of a body. A woman, her long hair hanging limply, huddled in the cramped space. Her clothes were rotten, but her pale face still showed pain and resentment. In that moment, I heard that voice again. "Don't leave me." As I stared at the woman's body curled up behind the wall, I felt as if the air in the room had been sucked out. A chill ran down my spine, and I couldn't take my eyes off her pale face. Her eyes were sunken, but the resentment and pain was still evident on her face. I didn't know how long she had been lying there, but it was clear that she hadn't come there on her own. I stepped back, holding the flashlight, trembling. Inside that cramped space, her body had rotted, but her clothes, hair, and a small necklace remained. A faint beam of light from the flashlight illuminated the scratches on the bricks. Those marks were unmistakable. She had been locked up here while she was still alive. A feeling of disgust mixed with fear welled up inside me. I put down the flashlight, trying to examine it more closely. As the light shifted, I saw something lying right next to her. A small notebook. I didn't know where I got the courage, but I reached in and pulled the notebook out of the darkness. The cover was rotten, the pages stuck together, but a few lines were still legible. June 13th. He said I was a burden. He said I didn't deserve to live, but I couldn't leave him. I couldn't. I read that, and a shiver ran through me. This short account showed not only that she had been murdered, but also the mental anguish she had endured. I flipped through the pages, but most of them were damaged. However, a short paragraph at the end of the notebook was clear. "If anyone finds me, please bring him to light. He cannot escape. He must pay." These lines were like a curse, a final message to anyone brave enough to explore the secret of the wall. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to call the police, but another part of me feared that this would never be resolved. Who would believe me if I said that whispering and tapping led me to this discovery? I picked up the notebook and stood up, but my legs felt like they had no strength left in them. The lights in the room flickered again, and from behind me, I heard a chuckle. Not a happy laugh, but a distorted, cold sound, like the laugh of someone who had lost all hope. I turned around, shining the flashlight into the hole in the wall. She was still there, but this time, I felt like her eyes, though empty, were fixed on me. A cold air poured out of the hole, making me feel like I was standing before a gate leading somewhere far away, very dark. I put the notebook down and took a few steps back. The laughter stopped, and the room fell into complete silence. I stood there, not knowing what to do next. All I could think of was the last words in the notebook. He must pay. Who was he? And what could I do to free her, or prevent something worse from happening? I had no answers, but I knew that, from this moment on, I could no longer ignore it. I had to face the truth. no matter how scary it was. I didn't know what to do next. The room was still eerily quiet, save for the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. The woman's body behind the wall, the scratches on the tiles, and the words in the notebook. All of them were slowly becoming a horrible piece of a picture that I couldn't quite understand. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the sofa, the light from the only table lamp in the room, casting strange shadows on the wall. I tried to focus my thoughts, but everything in my head was a jumble. I knew I had to find out the identity of him, the person who had imprisoned her, causing this unjust death. But how to start? The notebook only revealed part of the story, and the rest was blurred or lost. When the sky was just getting light, I decided to go back to the apartment complex's library. Among the old papers and notebooks from years past, I hoped to find a clue. The library was small, dusty, and seemingly infrequently used. I began to rummage through files, old journals, and newspaper articles from decades past. And then I found it. A short news item from a local newspaper that had stopped publishing. The article was about a disappearance that had occurred years earlier in the apartment complex. A young woman named Maria had disappeared without a trace, and the last person to see her was her boyfriend, a man named Nathan. According to neighbors, Nathan and Maria had argued frequently, and Maria had confided that she felt controlled and threatened. However, Nathan denied any involvement when the police questioned him, and the case was eventually dropped. The name Nathan echoed in my head, and I couldn't forget the words in the notebook. He must pay. Maria was locked behind the wall, and Nathan was the only one who could do it. But if he had escaped all charges, how could I bring him to light? I returned to the apartment, feeling heavier than ever. Now I had a suspect's name, but I had no concrete evidence. Maria had been buried in the dark for too long, and what she wanted was not only to be found, but also to be brought to justice. But what could I do when I was alone in this fight? That night I sat by the wall again, not daring to break any further. I didn't want to touch that trapped body anymore, but I couldn't ignore it either. I whispered, "Maria, I will help you. I promise. But I need more time." For the first time, the whisper didn't ring out. There was only silence, as if she were listening to me. But then, I felt a cold wind blow past me, and a distant voice said, "Don't let him escape." I knew I couldn't hide. I had to find Nathan, confront him, and clear up this mess. But I didn't know where to start. All I had was a name and a wall of resentment. And I had a feeling that if I didn't act soon, Maria wouldn't stop. She would keep going until I kept my promise. When I began searching for Nathan, I had no idea it would take me to the darkest corners of the city. I contacted Maria's old neighbors, people who had lived in the apartment complex at the time of her disappearance. An older woman recalled that Nathan had left Houston shortly after Maria was reported missing, but where he had gone was unclear. He had disappeared from the map. The question still haunted me. What did Maria want me to do? Her promise that I would help her make Nathan pay was growing heavier. Every time I returned to the apartment, the room felt colder. The lights in the living room flickered frequently, and the knocking continued, even though I had broken through part of the wall. One night, as I sat at my desk, trying to sort through the information I had, I heard a knock that was louder than usual. I turned around, and the wall was no longer a patch of cracked brick. The flickering lights in the room made it seem as if it was moving. Then I heard Maria's voice, clearer and stronger than ever. "He must pay. Bring him back." I stood up and moved closer to the wall. But this time, I heard more than just a voice. I felt a cold breeze, as if someone had just walked through my room. I turned around, but no one was there. When I looked back at the wall, I saw new words written on the cracked brick. "Find him." I didn't know how the words had appeared, but they sounded like a command. Maria was no longer whispering. She was demanding, and I couldn't ignore her. I gathered everything I had: Nathan's name, the old newspaper article, the notebook, and started searching online. I dug through public databases, forgotten social media pages, personal profiles buried deep in old forms, and finally, I found a clue. A man named Nathan appeared in an old post from a forum for people who had lived in Houston. The post said that Nathan had moved to a small town in the Texas suburbs, a few hours' drive from Houston. He was a recluse, not socializing with anyone, and hardly anyone knew much about him. I decided to leave the next day. I didn't know what I would do if I saw Nathan, but I knew I couldn't go on living like this. Maria wouldn't leave me alone, and I couldn't escape the knocking, the whispering. I had to confront him, to free myself. That night I slept on the sofa, the light in the living room on. But I couldn't sleep deeply. I heard the whispering in my dreams, as if Maria was standing right next to me, whispering in my ear, "Don't let him escape." When I woke up, the room was quiet. But I knew my time was up. If I didn't go find Nathan, Maria would never let me go. She would always be there, behind the wall, whispering and demanding. I packed my bags, double-checked my information, and left the apartment at dawn. But as soon as I stepped out the door, I felt someone watching me. Not Maria, but something else. Faint but present. Maybe Nathan had sensed that the truth was approaching, or maybe it was just my imagination. I got into the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The road ahead was long and dark, but I knew I couldn't turn back. Maria had waited too long, and now I was the only one who could bring the truth to light.